İyi görünüyorsunuz.
Size de.
Evet, YouTube kanalımız açılıyor şu anda.
Do we? When shall I begin?
We will let you know. First, we will have our opening, and then when the chairman Recai Ünal takes, he will introduce you, and then we will start.
Okay.
Şimdi şeyimiz açıldı. Şeyimiz açıldı kanal. Tamam. Şimdi ben hemen bizim açış müziğimizi, jeneriğimizi başlatacağım. Neredeydi bu? Tamam. Kulaklığı çıkarmam lazım. Kulaklığı çıkarayım. Kulaklığı çıkardık.
Timur Bilgem, müzik başladı mı? Ses gelmiyor.
Ses geliyor değil mi?
Çok az geliyor. Bir de görüntü takıldı sanki.
Görüntü takıldı mı?
Evet.
Evet, akmıyor.
Takıldı. Ses de çok az geliyor Bilgem.
Bir dakika. Ben evden bağlanıyorum.
Peki.
Şimdi bir dakika tekrar gittim bunu. Recai Bilgen, ben tekrar başlatacağım. Herhangi bir şeylik olsa beni uyarın.
Peki.
Aynı zamanda biraz da kayda da alırız.
Görüntü takıldı Bilgem yine.
Görünüyor mu?
Görüntü takıldı. İlk fotoğrafta kaldı.
Bir dakika.
Evet hocam. Geldi başlıyoruz hocam.
Bakıyorum ne problemi var acaba? Bir bakayım şuna. Yaptığım zaman. Görüntü takılıyor. Peki bunu ben tekrar bu şeyi yapayım bir dakika. Tamam, bunu kapat. Tekrar açayım bunu. Tamam. Şimdi bir gene bakalım, deneyelim. Ne olacak?
İnşallah şimdi olur.
Evet, bir takılma oluyor. O zaman maalesef şeyi oynatamayacağız. Evet.
İlerliyordu aslında.
Teknik bir arıza oldu. Tamam. O zaman Recai Bilgem, siz başlatın.
Peki. Tamam. Evet. Saygıdeğer, sevgideğer Türk bilimciler, sevgili, değerli Türk bilimi severler, bugün TÜSATBİTİG'in 97. Türk Bilimi Sanaltayı başlıyor ve bugün, bu akşam çok değerli, yeryüzü ölçeğinde ünlü, görkemli bir Türk bilimci, hem tarihçi hem de dil bilimci, değerli Profesör Doktor Peter Benjamin Golden bilgemiz bizlere Hazarlar ve onların dilleri ile ilgili çok değerli bir sunum yapacaklar, bir tek konuşma sunacaklar. Yaklaşık olarak 1 saat ya da 1 saatten biraz daha uzun bir konuşma olacak. Kendisini çok fazla yormayacağız istediği gibi. Ve gerçekten çok güzel, önemli bir tek konuşma, konferans olacağını düşünüyorum. Hepinize saygılarımı, sevgilerimi sunuyorum ve öncelikle değerli Peter Benjamin Golden bilgemizin özgeçmişini sizlere sunmak istiyorum. Peter Benjamin Golden 1941 yılında doğdu. Eğitimi üzerine şunu söyleyebiliriz. Tarih lisansını Queen's College, Columbia University, New York'ta yaptı. 1963'te tamamladı. Ayrıca Peter Golden bilgemizin Dil ve Tarih Coğrafya Fakültesi'nde de kısa bir süre eğitim gördüğünü anlıyoruz. 1967 yılında. Bu bakımdan bir anlamda okuldaşım kendisi. Ben de Dil ve Tarih Coğrafya Fakültesi lisans dil bilimi mezunu olduğum için. Columbia University New York'ta tarih yüksek lisansını 1968 yılında tamamladı. Ve 1968 yılında Russian Institute'un sertifikasını aldı. 1970 yılında tarih üzerine doktora tezini yazdı. 1970 yılında tezinin başlığı Khazar Studies and History of Philological Inquiry into the Origins of the Khazars. Burada özellikle belirteyim, yazılışını o dönemde 1970 yılındaki doktora tezinde Peter Golden bilgemiz Q kesme azar biçimde, yani Khazar biçiminde belirlemiş. Ve birçok onursal ve profesyonel derneğe, birliğe üye olduğunu görüyoruz. Benim saydığım yaklaşık 25 kadar. Bunlardan kimilerini ben size belirteyim. Örneğin American Historical Association, American Oriental Society, Asian Studies Association, Association for the Advancement of Central Asian Studies, Association for the Study of Persianate Studies, Societies, Association of Members of the Institute for Advanced Study, AMAYAS, Byzantine Studies Conference, Central Eurasian Studies Society, Early Slavic Studies Association, Eurasian Linguistic Association, Middle Eastern Studies Association, Middle East Medievalists Association, Mongolia Society, Society for Iranian Studies, Society for the Study of Caucasia, Turkish Studies Association, Ukrainian Academy of Arts and Sciences in US, World History Association, World Türkoloji Association, honorary member of the Türk Dil Kurumu, honorary member of the Körösi Çoma Tarsasag Çoma de Körös Society of Hungarian Orientalists, honorary member of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. New York'ta Columbia Üniversitesi'nde 1968-1969 yılların arasında Russian Institute'un müdür yardımcılığını yapmış. Rutgers University Department of History içinde öğretim görevlisi olarak, yardımcı doçent olarak, profesör olarak ve ayrıca emekli profesör olarak çalışmış ve çalışıyor. 1969'dan günümüze değin. Şu anda aynı zamanda Turkish and Middle Eastern Studies'te de tarih bölümü yanında çalışmakta. Ve Middle Eastern Studies programının Rutgers Üniversitesi'nde müdürlüğünü yapmıştır. Aynı zamanda Middle Eastern The Center for Middle Eastern Studies'in de müdürlüğünü yapmıştır. Birçok yönetimsel görevlerde de bulunmuştur. Örneğin 1974-1980 yılları arasında bölüm başkanı olarak görev almıştır. 1983-1985 yılları arasında yine tarih bölümünde vekil başkan olarak görev yapmıştır. Daha sonra Middle Eastern Studies programının müdürü ve 2009 yılında emekli olmuştur. Şu anda Professor Emeritus of History sanıyla ve 2012'den bu yana da Turkish and Middle Eastern Studies'de süregelen görevlerini yerine getirmektedir. Çok sayıda kitabı, makalesi bulunmaktadır. Burada saymakla bitiremeyiz. Gerçekten üyelikleri çok bilimsel kuruluşlara, kurumlara, birkaçını yukarıda saymıştım zaten. En önemli kitaplarından söz edecek olursak, örneğin benim çok önem verdiğim Hazar Çalışmaları adlı bir kitabı var ki biliyorsunuz afişte de bunun tanıtımını, görselini vermiştik. Bu tam olarak bir tarih ve dil bilimi çalışması, tarih, dil bilimi hem de betik bilimi, filoloji diyebiliriz. Ve büyük ölçüde Peter Golden bilgemizi tanımlayan ve tanıtma gücü olan bir kitap. Ayrıca yine çok sayıda, çok büyük ölçüde dil çalışmalarına yer verdiği Türk Halkları Tarihine Giriş adlı bir kitabı var. Kendisinin doktora öğrencisi Osman Karatay bilgemiz, Profesör Doktor Osman Karatay bilgemiz çevirisini yapmış bu elimdeki kitabın. Ve bunun dışında örneğin Dünya Tarihinde Orta Asya adlı çok önemli bir kitabı var. Bunun dışında mesela 2003 yılında yayımlanan Nomads and Their Neighbors in the Russian Steppe, Turks, Khazars and Kipchaks in Variorum Collected Studies Series başlıklı bir kitabı var. Çok önemli. Ve dediğim gibi çok sayıda makalesi, bilim yazısı, bildirisi bulunuyor. Onların hepsini burada anlamıyoruz ne yazık ki. Başka bir kitap örneğin Turks and Khazars, Origins, Institutions and Interactions in Pre-Mongol Eurasia in Variorum Collected Studies Series'de bulunuyor. Bunun dışında bir de Hazarların kültür ve bütünüyle kültür ve dil tarihini anlatan bir ortak yazar olduğu kitap da var. Hazar World adlı, orada işte Zayaçkovski ile ve başka yazarlarla birlikte ortak yazar olarak yer alıyor. Evet, ben çok daha fazla zamanınızı almak istemiyorum. Peter Golden bilgemizin de zamanını çok almak istemiyorum ve hemen sözü kendisine veriyorum. Değerli Peter Golden bilgem, söz sizde. Buyurun. Here you are.
Thank you very much. My paper is on the Khazars and their language, or what I would say the present state of Khazar studies. This is a topic I've been dealing with for many decades now, sometimes in greater detail, sometimes just very briefly. The expression that often comes to mind is one not in English, but in the Chinese dialect of my wife from Shanghai, Tolangwe, which means heating up cold rice. In other words, it's a topic I've been to again and again and again, but sometimes even heating up the cold rice, I find something new, something that I hadn't observed before. And so there's always something. Well, with that as a preface, let me begin my comments, which will be both general in terms of the current state of Khazar studies, as well as some specific comments about various problems we have with placing the Khazar language. All right, without further ado, let me begin. The Khazar Cognate from roughly the mid-7th century to about 968, 969 was one of the largest polities of medieval Eurasia. It dominated lands from the Pontic steppes in Crimea to the Trans-Volga zone and from the North Caucasus to the Middle Volga, with core lands in the lower Volga North Caucasian steppes extending to the Don-Dnieper river region. It played a major role in trans-Eurasian commerce, as well as the trade between the northern forests and the Byzantine and Islamic empires. Yet with all of this, Khazar studies remain a series of problems, often politicized in scholarship and the media, and still lacking a full historical narrative. Unlike many of the nomad tribal unions of the Volga-Pontic steppe zone, the Khazar Cognate progressed from a nomadic conquest polity to a nomadic empire, or xenocracy. That is a nomadic tribal confederation ruling over a number of foreign tribute-paying, especially sedentary peoples or agrarian societies from whom they extracted surplus production. These terms have accrued a variety of definitions. Nikolai Krajin, well-known Russian anthropologist, in addition to the term xenocracies, refers to them as super complex chiefdoms. Functionally, at least with regard to the outside world, they behaved like states. The Khazar Cognate engaged in state-like activities, collecting taxes, custom duties, and tribute, and possessed a salaried standing army, a point, however, that is contradicted by some sources, which say that the army was not salaried. So one of the many problems we have with Khazar studies. Just what was the nature of the Khazar army? One of the most powerful in the region, but we still can't put precise numbers on it and can't even determine from the sources whether it was indeed a standing paid salaried army or one that was drawn from tribal levies and the like. Aside from the Khazars, only the Turks and Mongols, that is the Turks from the Turk Cognate in Mongolia extending all the way to the western zone, only the Turks and Mongols achieved that degree of political organization in the Western Steppe zone. At the summit of the Khazar polity stood a union of Turkic tribes deriving from the Turk Empire. The Khazar Khagans appear to have stemmed from the Turk royal clan, the Ashina, a name that appears only in Chinese sources, it might be added. A name that is possibly of Khotanese Saka origin, though that too is much debated. There are a lot of theories on this subject, which I will not get into here. Successors of the Western Turks, the Khazars ruled over a polyethnic, multi-confessional population of some 25 to perhaps 40 Turkic, Iranian, Finno-Ugric, Slavic, and North Caucasian peoples engaged in a variety of economic pursuits, pastoralism, agriculture, craft production, and hunting and gathering. The Turkic peoples of Khazaria included worshippers of Tengri, the Turco-Mongolian supreme celestial deity, various pagan cults, shamanism, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. The Khazar ruling elite and ultimately some elements of their core tribes adopted Judaism. Muslims appear to have predominated among the urban population, which consisted of indigenous as well as foreign groupings. Interestingly enough, Byzantine promoted Christianity, permitted by the Khazars certainly before their Judaization, is the monotheistic faith best attested archaeologically in Khazaria. The source of Jewish proselytizing remains uncertain. Crimea and Taman, the old Rus city of Tumutrakan near the Black Sea, are possible initiation points. Many lacunae in our knowledge of the language or languages, culture, material and spiritual, and internal history of the Khazars remain. Archaeological studies are uneven in coverage and depth. A growing number of forts, fortified settlements, some protecting trade routes, are currently being investigated. The precise location of Khazaria's capital city, Atil or Atil, depending on which Turkic dialect or which Turkic language one accepts as their major tongue, the Turkic word for the Volga River itself, on whose banks it was located, a major trade emporium for trans-Eurasian commerce, remains uncertain. Recent research suggests that it may be identified with the ruins at Samazilka, an archaeological site some 40 kilometers from Astrakhan on the lower Volga. But this attribution requires further substantiation, as do very recent, as recently as 2020, attempts to connect it with Semibugre in the Volga Delta, another Городище or archaeological ruin site. Traces of other Khazar towns, such as Khamlig or Khamlij, Khanbaluk, Sarakhshin, later perhaps Saksin, if these are not actually the names of parts of Atil, have not been found. Atil, aside from several mud brick buildings used for administrative purposes, consisted largely of nomad tents, impermanent in nature, and hence hard to trace archaeologically. The Khazars are mentioned in a variety of sources in Arabic, Middle and Neo-Persian, Hebrew, Syriac, Greek, Latin, Armenian, Georgian, Old Slavonic, and Chinese. That's just the beginning. The latter, Chinese sources, provide some of our earliest notices based in part on the accounts of Du Huan, who was taken prisoner at the Battle of Talas in 751. And in these sources, which derive from his account, which has been lost, they are termed Tuje Kısa or Türk Khazar or Kısa Tuje Khazar Türk, pointing to the Türk origin or close association with them. Türk and Khazar are used interchangeably and sometimes anachronistically in our sources. When I'm using the word Türk, I'm referring specifically to the Türk Empire, not all of the Turkic peoples. There I use the word Turkic. So we have problems with this. Türk and Khazar, as I said, are used interchangeably, sometimes anachronistically, in a variety of our sources. Aside from several documents written in Hebrew, one with an added inscription in one of the old Turkic runic scripts, we have no written works stemming directly from the Khazars. In other words, no texts in their own language. There are graffiti and symbols carved on objects with inscriptions and variants of the Turkic runic script. These have been unearthed in Khazar territories, but their attribution and decipherment remain uncertain. Much of our knowledge of their history, system of governance, and religions comes from the Muslim geographers of the 9th and 10th centuries. Drawing on earlier accounts, most probably deriving information brought by travelers and merchants, collected into works on the roots and kingdoms, the famous Kitab al-Masalik al-Mamalik, as early as the latter half of the 9th century. They were composed for the caliphal government or local Islamic governments, such as the Samanids. An important official source was the report of Salam the interpreter, whom the Caliph al-Wathiq, who ruled from 842 to 847, sent in the early 840s to the Northlands to find the barrier that Alexander the Great was reputed to have erected against the barbarians of the north, the peoples of Gog and Magog, Yuj wa Majuj. Salam may have been himself of Khazar origin and certainly knew Turkic language as well. His travels brought him to the Khazar capital on the Volga. Ibn Khordadbeh died around 912, but was writing in the 840s, 850s, and then again re-edited his famous work in the 880s. An Abbasid official of Persian origin, who authored the fundamental book of Roots and Kingdoms, wrote down Salam's dictated report for the Caliph. The 10th century geographers mix chronologically disparate data. There is also the growing, albeit still sparse, testimony of Khazar coins. These are imitations of Islamic dirhams that circulated widely in the region. Some have the added notation in Arabic of Ard al-Khazar, the land of the Khazars, and are dated to the early part of the 9th century. Muslim sources list the Khazars among the Turkic peoples, although not without inconsistencies. Ibn al-Faqih, writing around 903, notes the Khazars and the Turks separately, seemingly pointing to a distinction between the two, or at least that is one interpretation given to his comments. Al-Maqdisi, writing around 966 of the military servitors, the Ghilman of the Byzantine emperors, says that the majority are, and I'm quoting now, the majority are Turks and Khazars. Again, separating the two. Khazar and Turk Ghilman, that is military slaves or military servants in Abbasid service, are both lumped together and occasionally confused in our sources. They resided in separate but adjacent quarters in Samarra. Reports on Khazar linguistic affiliations are equally muddled. Al-Istakhri, writing before 950, remarks that and I'm quoting now, the language of the Khazars is not the language of the Turks and the Persians, nor is the language of any other faction of humanity associated with it, end quote. But elsewhere, he states that the language of the Bulgars, which we know is a West Old Turkic language, a Uric language, is like that, mithla, is like that of the Khazars. Al-Muqaddasi, writing around 985, possibly a little bit later, who traveled throughout the Muslim world, but probably based his information on the Khazars from Al-Istakhri and other accounts, declares that, and I'm quoting, the language of the Khazars is quite incomprehensible. Shadid al-Inghiglaq. Al-Biruni, who is writing around 1048, reports that that Volgo-Bulgaric was a mixture of Turkic and Khazar. The 50-odd known Khazar words, mainly titles, names, toponyms, point to Turkic, but Khazar affiliations within Turkic remain disputed, as we shall see. The term or ethnonym Khazar is etymologically, Khazar etymologically problematic. Time will not permit us to discuss all of the problems. A few may be noted, however. The North Caucasian Hun chieftain, Alp Ilituer, noted in Mofses das Khuransi, bears the title Helitber, usually read as Elitber, and corresponds to the Yultawar variant noted among the Volga Bulgars, and probably represents the form Ilituer. This title was of non-Turkic origin, like almost all of the old Turkic titles. In the Turk state, the Helitber, or Elitber, was the ruler of subordinate tribal unions, tribes and client states, often retaining considerable autonomy and even de facto independence. Such was the position of Alp Ilituer. The Volga Bulgar form, Yultavar, and here you'll see the different forms in that sheet that I've given out. Perhaps Yultawar, perhaps to be pronounced Yultawar, points to yet another issue, the initial Y at the beginning of some of these terms. The Al-Balkhi, Al-Istakhri, Ibn Hawqal tradition, repeated in Yaqut, comments that the king, the Kaghan Beg is meant here, who quote, lives in the western part of Etil, is called Beg, Kef, and he is also called Bag. Again, if you have the handout, you can see the two different written forms. While the latter might conceivably point to a variant form, bag, for beg, it is more likely a corruption of yilig, which is an Oghuric variant of Eastern Old Turkic Elik. Yeah, you can see the titles there, beg, bek, bag, etc. And yilig, Elik, is reflected in the name of the Hungarian ruler Arpad's son Yelech, noted in Constantine Porphyrogenitus. The latter form, like the Pech of Khazaria noted in that same source, shows the shift in Khazar of ge, re, che, and then finally zero. Thus, Khagan Beg in Ibn Fadlan is recorded as Khagan Beh. So we have a shift ultimately of beg to beh in Khazar. This is one feature we know of the Khazar language. The initial yes sound may point to a West Old Turkic Oghuric orientation of this language. Bagatur, the name, or rather title-based name of a Khazar Khagan, is noted around 760, and it's typical of the kinds of material that we have. It derived from the Inner Asian heritage of the Turkic peoples, most probably from the Roran, but it is unclear if these titles are original with them. Much more complicated is the name or title written in a range of Arabic script sources as Barjik. And you can see that further down beneath Yol Tawar. You can see the form as it appears in most of our written sources. And we find variants of it in Dal Ami, in this translation of Tabari, in the form of Barsik, Barsink, etc. We find variants in Athma al-Kufi, Marstik bin Khakan, Narsik bin Khakan, and so on. And then we find corruptions of it in the Turkish translation of At-Tabari. All of them would appear to render something akin to the name Barsbeg, which may or may not correspond to a name recorded in an Armenian source, Revond, as Parsbit. But in Revond, that name is recorded as the name of the mother of the Khagan, not as the Khagan. Ibn Athem al-Kufi calls Barsbeg the son of the Khagan. The issue remains unresolved. Also unresolved are names such as Buluchan or Buluchan, Buljan, Georgian Buluchan. You can see the different forms there, and Arabic Buljan, the name of a Khazar military commander noted around the year 800 in Georgian accounts, and in the much later Tarikh al-Bab of Munajim Basha, the Ottoman historian, who notes him under the year 901 as the name of the father of a king of the Khazars, a certain Kasab, perhaps Köse, an interesting odd name, first name, Ksa bin Buljan, who attacked Bab al-Abwab or Darband. The well-known and very high title Shad appears as Ishad or Isha in Ibn Rusta and Abshad in Gardezi, probably stemming from an Iranian, that is a Sogdian form originally, Akhshid, also recorded as Akhshad. The Khazar form again reflects this transition of Akhshad to Ikhshad, Ikhshad, Ikhshad, and finally Ishad, with a shift of Kh, H, and then zero, as we have in Beg and Yilik above. Ronatash, the Hungarian Altaisis, suggests that Ishad represents Western Old Turkic adaptation of Ikhshad, and Shad is the Eastern Old Turkic version. Although why Western Old Turkic and Eastern Old Turkic should have different versions of this borrowed title is unclear. The form Shad is found in Mofses das Khuransib in the form Shad, and most probably refers not to the Khazar, but to the Western Turk military commander, indicating that Shad was the form used among the Turks, Eastern and Western. The Shads, as a grouping, usually stem from the royal house. In Khazaria, it has been argued, the Shad held sway over the eastern territories, especially Dagestan, and the Yabgu, also stemming from the royal house, ruled the western territories on the Kuban. Yabgu or Jabgu Khagan was the normal title of the Western Turk ruler. Aside from references to Jebu Khakan in Mofses Dashuransi and Jibga or Jibru in the Georgian sources, probably referring to the Western Turk commander who was the ally of the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius in the late 620s against the Sassanids in Transcaucasia, mention is not made directly of the Khazar Yabgu or Jabgu. The existence of this title among the Khazars is implied, however, in the name, which is based on a title of the Hungarian king Geza, which appears in Byzantine sources as Getsas, Geovitsas, appears in Latin sources in similar forms, Gecha, etc., and was probably taken from Khazar form, initially Jewu, Western Old Turkic Jabgu, becoming Jewu in later work, and which occurs as Geovica in a Hungarian diminutive form, Geocha. Typical of the kinds of problems we encounter is the figure described by the 9th century historian Al-Yaqubi as the deputy, Khalifa, of the Khazar Khagan, who bears the name, what appears to look like Yazid Bulash or Yazir Yulash, or any number of other possibilities, as the two manuscripts of the word that of the work that we have give us the form Yazid, and then something which can be read as Bulash, Yulash, or Yalash, etc., and then another form Yazid or Yazir, Yalash, Bulash, all of them without the necessary nukta needed to distinguish the proper reading. In addition to these philological issues, the notice appears to refer to the late Sassanid era, when, according to this author, the Khazars had become victorious over the people of Armenia. This, again, is a highly problematic statement, as the Khazars, as such, late Sassanid era, had not yet really come into being. Moreover, the deputy would appear to denote the sub-Khagan, the Khagan Beg of later authors, and this is much too early for the Khazar dual kingship. Of course, it is possible that Al-Yaqubi confused the Khazars with some other people. The passage describes rather the struggles between the Sassanids and the Romans, that is, the Eastern Romans, the Byzantines, for dominion over Transcaucasia. Or anachronistically, he simply places them in these events. We'll discuss aspects of the Khazar Beg sacral kingship institution somewhat later on. Another problematic title is recorded by Ibn Fadlan, one of our few sources who actually journeyed to the area. He went to Volga, Bulgaria as part of a caliphal mission to help implant Islam there in 921, 922. The term that we're interested in is preserved not in the manuscript that we have, partial manuscript that we have of Ibn Fadlan's very important work, but is preserved in Yaqut, who's writing centuries later. Yaqut died in 1229. In a lengthy citation he gives of this part of Ibn Fadlan's work. And it refers to the Jawshirir. And you'll see under Yazid Bulash, you'll see that the way it's normally given in the printed editions, who is the deputy of the Kundu Khagan, who in turn was the deputy to the Khagan Beg, the lesser but de facto governing ruler under the now sacralized Khazar Khagan. The title has yet to receive a satisfactory explanation. Lots of explanations, but none of which really make 100% sense. We'll have more to say about the Kundu Khagan later on. The Byzantine historian Theophanes, around 812, In his account of the Emperor Justinian II's complicated period of rule, he ruled twice from 685 to 695 and 705 to 711, and had a mismatched alliance with the Khazars, mentions the funeral proceedings that were given for a Khazar Tugun who perished in the course of various political disputes. He mentions in Greek, is dochin aftu, and I'll explain that word in a minute, a proceedings at which some 300 soldiers were sacrificed in the honor of the Khazar Tulun. Dohi is probably Dori, recorded as Dohya in Menander's description of the funeral rites for the Western Turk Sirjabu Kaghan Ishtami. The word is cognate with Eastern Old Turkic yog, funeral feast, wake. So does this delta, stand for an interdental the, which later became a z, and then finally a y sound in a Turkic, or the phoneme j? For example, the name for the Ural River is given early on as Daich, when it stands for what was later Jayık in some Turkic languages and Yayık in other Turkic languages. Again, we lack sufficient data to draw a definitive conclusion on the subject. So, summing up the language question, and I've given you a lot of scattered references here, but some of just highlighting a few of the problems. Summing up the language question with regard to the Khazars, one should bear in mind, first of all, that a number of Turkic languages were spoken by the populations of the Cognate. These included speakers of both East and West Old Turkic. Our sources render the name, for example, of an important fort built with Byzantine assistance, best known as Sarkil, standing for what was probably something like Şarikil or Sarkil, in, again, a variety of forms. I don't know if I have it, yes, I have there. You'll find Greek and then two Hebrew forms noted with very different pronunciations, both open to readings as Eastern Old Turkic or Western Old Turkic, that is Common Turkic or Oghur Turkic. The Greek translation of the name is the white quarters or the white dwelling, Aspron Ospition, would seem to point to Western Old Turkic, but the word Sarık in Old Turkic is a complicated word. It probably is the modern Turkish sarı, yellow, but it also can apparently mean white in some Old Turkic languages. So we have a problem there. The toponym Sarıkşın, a Khazar city or part of the Khazar capital Etil, presents similar problems. Is it Sarıkşın, Şarıkşın? We don't know. Lacking a full text in Khazar, one cannot determine based on the scattered personal names, titles, and toponyms what was the real language of the Khazars. There is little reason to doubt that it was Turkic, but what kind of Turkic, we cannot really tell. Indeed, the Khazar ruling elite, with its Western Turk background, may well have spoken a language that was distinct from numerous West Old Turkic, Oghuric-speaking Turkic subjects. The peoples of Khazar, and I should perhaps now give a very quick background about Khazar origins to put this into some kind of a context. The peoples of Khazaria emerged out of the welter of nomads that came to Central Eurasia and the Western Eurasian steppes in the aftermath of the fragmentation and collapse of the Shungnu realm, the late 3rd century BCE, 1st centuries CE. These Huns were followed by various Oghuric Turkic peoples around 460, 463, and others fleeing the Roran or Asian Avars and Northern Wei wars of the 430s and 458. The Oghur tribes spoke West Old Turkic, which survives today only in Chuvash. The East Old Turkic equivalent is Oğuz, a name that'll be familiar to all of you, Oğuz. They were part of a large, loosely organized tribal confederation called Tiele, which we think in Old Chinese may have rendered something like Tegreg in the 6th, 8th centuries. A tribal union, I would use the word union only very loosely, that extended from the area north of Mongolia to the western steppe zone. The Tiele contained other, probably non-Turkic elements, for example, the Iranian or Iranic Alans, who are noted as east of Fulin, or east of Byzantium in the Chinese sources. By the early 6th century, the Sabirs, perhaps a Turkicized Serbi-Mongolic people, and Serbi is a relatively new term that is being used. It replaces the term slightly awkward para-Mongol. In other words, Mongol language and its various sub-branches that we know today stem from an original Proto-Mongolian language. Alongside of that, para-Mongolic was another language stemming from yet an earlier pre-Proto-Mongolic language. A language that has many similarities with Mongol, or Mongolic, and many differences. And so now we speak of the Serbi Xianbei, was the Chinese rendering of this term. And it seems that Sabir may be a metaphysized, Turkicized Serbi-Mongolic people who under Roran Avar pressure had driven the Oghuz westward and now arrived in the Volga region in the early 6th century. These people flicker in and out of our sources, reflecting both the ephemeral nature of some of the unions and the discontinuities in their relations with their imperial neighbors. The Sabirs emerged as a dominant and oft-sought ally of both empires, Byzantine and Sassanid, or Persian, and then Caliphal. They extended their favor, or rather pre-Caliphal. They extended their favors to both Constantinople and Iran, and occasionally extended their favors to both at the same time. Were the Khazars among the waves of peoples migrating to the western steppes, as some would believe? The rise of the Türk Cognate under Bumun, who ruled only very briefly 552-553 of the Ashina clan, altered the situation across the Eurasian steppes. By the late 550s, early 560s, under Bumun's brother Ishtemi, or Istemi, who died in 576 and who bore the title of Yabgu Khagan, the Turks advanced westward in a brief alliance with Iran, 557 or so, perhaps even a bit later, even a decade later. Ishtemi destroyed the Hephthalite state, one of the largest and wealthiest states of Central Eurasia, and extended Turk power to the Western Eurasian steppes. A people who called themselves Avars soon appeared in the Western Eurasian steppes, perhaps as early as 558, made contact with Constantinople. It is unclear whether these European Avars were the remnants of the Roran Avars or of the Hephthalites who contained Asian Avar elements, or some other people who simply used the prestigious Avar name to claim power in the steppe. There's a big argument that has been going on for almost a century about this question. By 568, the Turks had driven these Avars, whoever they were, and some of their subject tribes to Pannonia and dispatched an embassy to Constantinople, offering the prospect of an entente, an understanding, a kind of an alliance against Iran. To understand the formation of the Khazar polity, we need to say something further about the Turk state from which it derived. The Turk Cognate consisted of two wings, east and west, each ruled by a Khagan, but the eastern Khagan enjoyed a slightly higher status. Sometime between 581 and 603, or perhaps as late as 610, the Western Turks emerged as a de facto autonomous state. The Western Turk ruler, Tong Yabu Khagan, who ruled around 618 to perhaps as late as 630, provided crucial assistance to the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, who ruled 610 to 641 in his wars with Iran that ended with the defeat of the latter in 628. Moses das-Khurantsi, in his account of these events, consistently and probably anachronistically calls the Khazars Turks. Moses das-Khurantsi, I should add, a very important Armenian source. The problem is that though it stems from the 7th century or thereabouts, had numerous hands that mixed into it later on. It was constantly re-edited, additions made here and there, so it's very, very hard to determine when things are being used or when terms are being used anachronistically. In any event, he regularly refers to the Turks who were the allies of the Emperor Heraclius as Khazars. The Eastern and Western Turks were compelled to recognize Tang overlordship in 630 and 659, respectively. The Khazars appear to have emerged out of Western Turk-Tunisian strife, most probably in the period between 630 and 650, which paved the way for the Tang conquest. One hypothesis based on circumstantial evidence suggests that the Western Turk Khagan, Yipi Shevwe, who ruled from 643 to 649, or one of his descendants fleeing the factional strife, founded the Khazar royal clan. This is just a theory, perhaps a good one, but a theory nonetheless. The forms of governance of and the titulature associated with the Khazar Cognate clearly stem from the Turk tradition. The Khazar ruler bore the imperial title Khagan, which in the steppe world of that era was borne only by members of established ruling houses, pointing strongly towards the Ashina origins of the Khazar royal dynasty, as also does the investiture ceremony, in which the Khagan, both the Eastern Turk Khagan and the Khazar Khagan, was ritually strangled, and on the point of passing out, was asked, "How many years will you rule?" And whatever number came out of his mouth, that was supposed to be the length of his rule. So he'd been transported into a shamanic mystical state in contact with supernatural forces, and could then predict the future in that sense. In addition, the regal accoutrements of the Khazar Khagans were again similar to that of the Turks, the Eastern Turks. He had a golden tent, he had a golden throne, all of which are recorded in Chinese accounts of the Turks, typical of the Turk Khagans. Who then were the Khazars? Were they an offshoot of the Western Turks? Were they a distinct tribe or people that became subjects of the latter? Were they some combination of Oghuric, Sabir, and Turk tribes brought together under the rule of a Western Turk Ashina dynasty? The latter notion appears to have the largest number of adherents, although the details of this process remain rather conjectural. These are all sort of put together, various hypotheses put together. Indeed, one wonders if the word Khazar is not etymologically related to the word Kazakh, which itself is problematic, which we don't have an accepted root. And it was initially not a tribal name, but was a social term. That is a group that had broken away, was rebellious, wandered off, the original meaning of Kazakh. So these are a number of hypotheses. One theory equates the ethnonym Khazar with Akatiroi, mentioned by the early Byzantine sources. In other words, standing for Khazar, white Khazar, noted as early as the 4th century. Problems with that is that was Ak being used at that time when Ürüngü was more common for white. Another suggests that the Khazars were in essence the older Sabir union now under Ashina overlordship. Support for this view is taken from Al-Mas'udi, who in his Tanbih, written in 956, remarks that the Khazars, who are called Sabir in Turkic and Khazaran in Persian, are a variety, a jins of settled Turks. In Arabic, the name is pronounced Khazar. However, the manuscript tradition, as you'll see noted in the handout, has actually Bishr and Yisr and Sabir remains only a learned conjecture. And so we don't really know if is Mas'udi really telling us this or not. Yet another theory derives from the Uyghur Khazar tribe. Khazar, it is argued, being the Oghuric variant of the ethnonym Khazar. This would closely tie them to the Oghur, Oghuz, and larger Tiele world. Evidence for the Khazar is adduced from the fragmentary Tes inscription and a Terhin inscription dated to 750 and 762, which it is argued allude to conflicts from the period 582 to 603 when the Türk Cognate split into Eastern and Western Cognates. The Khazars, or Khazars rather, part of the more westerly Tiele Oghur Oghuz group, went off to the Western periphery, founding their own polity, the Khazars. This at least is one theory. The problem is that the texts are incomplete and open to a variety of readings. Moreover, the Chinese characters used to render the Persian, to render the Uyghur Khazar are Gesa, and I've given the characters there, are different from what we usually find Kusa, which is used to render Khazar in the Chinese accounts. Adding to the complexity of the question, Movsestas Khuransi notes a certain Chat Khazar. In other words, the name Khazar appears as a personal name, who is the Chamberlain of Avcı Tarkhan of the North Caucasian Huns, who were subject tribe of the Khazars. Seemingly distinct from the Chatan Khazar, one of the chiefs of Alp-Ilituer. But again, there may be confusion in this. In the inscriptions that I mentioned before, the Bersil, a person or a tribe, are noted alongside the Khazars, bringing to mind people bearing this name in Armenian, Byzantine, and Tibeto-Uyghur sources, and perhaps Joseph's letter. Joseph was a Khazar Cognate. 9th century Byzantine accounts, Theophanes and Nicephorus, going back to a common source from 720, describe the Khazars as issuing forth from Berselias in the first Sarmatia, or from an area next to Sarmatia, a toponym mirrored in Arabic and Persian sources as Barshalia, Barsalia, and as an ethnonym Barsula in Volga, Bulgaria, in Syriac as Barsalia, Barshalia, in Armenian as Baslats, Barslats, in the Armenian geography. All of this is very problematic, and indeed the exact location of Barsalia is uncertain. The 12th century Michael Cyrus, who copies from many of these earlier accounts, calls it the country of the Alans, seemingly that would place it in the North Caucasus, or possibly in the Don Donetsk region. The Bersil name or ethnonym in its various forms would seem to give some credence to this Khazar theory. But again, the information is to some degree conjectural, and we do not have any specific source that says A leads to B. Somewhat removed from the Uyghur and Oghur Sabir Türk hypotheses is the suggestion that the Khazars stem from the Hephthalites that had migrated to the Caucasus from a region near Khurasan in the late 5th, early 6th century, and here joined with the Sabirs and other tribes. A connection with the Kidara Chionites has also been advanced. In short, Khazar origins in the sense of specific tribes or peoples from whom they are to be derived remain problematic. Indeed, was Khazar an actual tribal name or social term akin to Kazakh, as I've already mentioned? The first notice on the Khazars in the Arab geographical literature is, again, somewhat problematic. It stems from Al-Khwarizmi, writing around 833, he died around 847, who places them in the middle Sirdarya region, east of Khwarezm, well to the east of where we would expect to find them. Subsequent sources, dating to the latter half of the 9th and 10th centuries, situate them in the Volga, North Caucasian Don zone, and provide reliable accounts of their struggles against the Arabs and the Bulgars. In 641-642, the Arabs advanced into the Caucasus, ultimately sparking many clashes over Balanjar and Samandar around 653, Khazar urban centers in the North Caucasus. Arabs' account of that period, as has been noted, used the term Turk and Khazar interchangeably, further complicating identifications. By the latter half of the 7th century, or perhaps as late as the 720s, the accounts vary, the Khazars were forced to move their capital, either Samandar or Balanjar. Again, we get, even within the same source, contradictory accounts, to the lower Volga to avoid Arab attacks. Meanwhile, the Khazars prevailed in their struggle with the numerically superior Bulgars. The Bulgar Union, Magna Bulgaria, west of the Khazars, had fragmented after Kubrat's death, perhaps 650, perhaps as late as 665. Elements of these Bulgars fled to Byzantine Moesia around 679, ultimately giving rise to the later Slavicized Balkan Bulgar state. But some Bulgars, the so-called Black Bulgars, Chorny Bulgari of the old Rus sources, increasingly sedentarizing, remained under Khazar rule in both the Pontic steppes, and subsequently groups of them migrated 8th and 9th century to the Middle Volga, where they later formed the vassal state of the Khazars, the Volga Bulgars, by the late 9th, early 10th century. By the 650s, 660s in any event, we can speak with certainty of a Khazar Cognate, its contours emerging in the context of wars with the Arabs and the Bulgars. By the 670s and 680s, it had become the dominant power in the Volga, Pontic, Caspian steppes, and one of the principal rivals of the expanding Arabian Caliphate, contesting their domination of the Caucasus and preventing further advances into the Volga and Black Sea zone. This struggle continued throughout the 8th century. Arab armies on occasion marched deep into Khazar lands in the North Caucasus, and then quickly and sometimes ingloriously retreated. Some Khazar raids may have been coordinated with Byzantine initiatives or defense requirements. They did not aim to take or hold territory, but were strategic raids, in part for booty and in part to establish tributary relations. A notable exception, however, perhaps even an inflection point, in this seesaw struggle occurred in 737, when the Umayyad general and later Caliph Marwan captured the Khazar Khagan in a stealthy and daring raid into the Khazar domains in the Volga region, which also took some 20,000 Burtas families captive and subsequently subjugated some of the North Caucasian statelets. The Khagan was compelled to convert to Islam, but abjured it after the Arab army had withdrawn from the region. The Muslim accounts make no further mention of it, unusual if it had been an event of lasting significance. Nonetheless, a hint at some continuation of Islam among the Khazar ruling class is implied in Al-Istakhri's notice regarding a member of the Khazar ruling clan who was barred from the Khaganal position because he was a Muslim, and the Khaganate by that time was given only to those who had Judaized. The Khazar commander, who was killed by Marwan's forces, bore the title Hazar Tarkhan and commanded some 40,000 sons of Tarkhans. 40,000 is perhaps too round a number, and is not plausible, but Tarkhan was certainly an important title and points to the kind of comitatus that surrounded the Khazar Khagans. Tarkhan was an important Inner Asian title already noted in the Sogdian language Bugut inscription of the Turks. The use of Persian Hazar 1000 as the name of the Khazar commander has yet to be satisfactorily explained. The victory of 737 was the last of the significant Arab forays into Khazaria and may have been part of a larger caliphal offensive in the 730s that established uneasy borders with the Franks in the west in 732 and with the Western Turks in Central Asia in 737. By around 800, the Arab Khazar frontier had stabilized in the North Caucasus. Thereafter, Arabo-Khazar relations became largely commercial rather than political, rather than military, and Atil, the Khazar capital, became an emporium for the east-west, north-south trade, part of the larger Silk Road system, which traversed Eurasia. Derband, or Arab Bab al-Abwab in Dagestan, became the primary border city between the two empires. Like the Turks before them, the Khazars had established an uneasy entente with Byzantium based on a common foe, the Arab Caliphate, buttressed by a marital tie. Marital ties with foreigners were highly unusual for reigning Byzantine monarchs. This is indeed the only instance that we really know of it at this time, indicating for that moment, that is 732, that Constantinople had great need of the Khazars. Khazar influence through marital ties also extended to Western Georgia, Abkhazia, where Leon II was the grandson of the Khazar Cognate. In 786, he broke away from Byzantine overlordship with Khazar support. The Khazars thus were not Constantinople's junior partners, but pursued an independent foreign policy, sometimes in tandem with Byzantium and other times not. Well before the mid-10th century, Atil and Constantinople viewed each other with hostility. In addition to strategic considerations, the failure of the Khazars to convert to Christianity may have played a role. This was a diplomatic failure on the part of Constantinople. The Khazars rather took a course that put some distance between themselves and Constantinople. They converted to Judaism. The Khazar conversion to Judaism is reported to have occurred during the caliphate of Harun al-Rashid, who ruled from 786 to 809. The question of adopting one of the major universal religions of the Mediterranean world became an issue for the Khazars after the forced but brief conversion to Islam in 737. Confirmation for the significance of Judaism in Khazaria by the early 9th century can be seen in Khazar coins of 837 and 838, which were imitations of Arab dirhams, some of which substituted the words Musa Rasul Allah, Moses is the messenger of God rather than the customary Muslim profession of faith. The causes as well as the stages of the conversion have been much debated. Resistance in some quarters cannot be precluded. Typical of the conversion process among steppe peoples, it was initiated at the highest level of government. For example, the Uyghur conversion to Manichaeism in China in 732 was carried out by the Khagan and with some hostility within the ruling group. There is no evidence that the conversion was aimed at the strengthening of Khaganal power. Indeed, the extent of Judaization remains unclear. Ibn Rusta, writing in the early 10th century, probably copying earlier reports, maintained that aside from the elite, the majority of the Khazars were adherents of a language similar to that of the Turks. His contemporary, Ibn al-Faqih, writing in 903, as we've seen, and Ibn Fadlan in the 920s report that the ruler and the Khazars were all Jews. So we have, again, contradictory information, and we don't know when they use the expression that they were all Jews, whether that referred to just what we may term the ethnic Khazars, part of the inner tribal ruling group, or it meant certainly not the whole of the state. Archaeological evidence of Judaization is thus far sparse. DNA analyses of Khazar burial finds point to a population of Turkic origin. Of this, there's little doubt, though the latest studies done recently by Kornienko and Tatarino indicate, and others indicate, a population overall that had certainly a strong concentration of DNA that we would associate with Turkic peoples, but also had lots of West Eurasian and other elements, which is again what we would find in a typical polyglot state like the Khazar Empire. none of the DNA connections thus far shows connections with ethnic Jewish populations. However, Khazar sites are far from fully investigated, and DNA ethnicity attributions are open to different interpretations. The continuation of paganism, that is the Tengri cult and other practices, remains also insufficiently examined, mainly because we do not have enough data, and some of the material that we have, bits of pictorial representations of Khazar, what we think may have been Khazar myths or Khazar mythical Khazar heroes, are open to, again, a wide variety of interpretations. Within the royal clan, only those professing Judaism, this the Arab sources tell us, only those professing Judaism were eligible to rule. Yet to the Khazars, the conversion did not signify their transformation into righteous proselytes, which would make them full members of the Jewish people. Although there is one narrative that refers to, one Khazar narrative that refers to a return to Judaism, which implies that somehow these were Israelites that had become Turkicized and so on, one of the lost tribes. There was even a long paper that was on academia.edu, which some of you may be familiar with, which produced a lot of shouting and made little sense, frankly. But that is another story. Rather, what we have in the letter of the Khazar ruler Joseph, who's writing around 960 to Hasta ibn Shaprut, who was a Jewish courtier of Umayyad Spain, and presents what may be considered an official view, since it's coming from the Khagan, says that the Khazars entered Judaism but remained descendants of Togarma, which in the medieval Jewish and some of the Muslim conceptions of the genealogy of peoples pointed to the Turkic world. In other words, what he was emphasizing was that, yes, their religion, in religion they had become Judaized, but ethnically they were Turks, and that of course accounted for, that was prestigious in terms of his followers. According to the most reliable information that we have, the Khazars converted to the Rabbinite, not the Karaite form of Judaism. There are a number of texts that, a number of works that imply that the Karaites, the few remaining Karaites in the Crimea and in Lithuania and elsewhere, who originally stem from the Crimea and the Golden Horde, speak Turkic, and among the northern grouping speak a rather archaic, or speak a Turkic with many archaic elements, but this is a Kuman Turkic. It's not the Turkic that was spoken by the Khazars. Contemporary Karaite references to the Khazars are disparaging. Indeed, one source even refers to them as mamzerim, the Hebrew term meaning bastards, illegitimate children, which would not be a term used if they were members of that particular faction. Byzantine sources, unlike contemporary Muslim accounts, are silent regarding Khazar Judaism. Indeed, they're surprisingly silent about much of Khazar history, even though the Byzantines were so intimately tied with the Khazars in many respects. An exception is the Byzantine-styled Old Slavonic life of Saint Constantine, or Cyril, who was an ambassador or missionary to the Khazars around the year 860, and was later, in 863, the apostle to the Slavs, and who plays an important role in the beginning of the Christianization of the Slavic peoples. His life was written around 885. The embassy, which, as I said, took place around 860, perhaps prompted by the 860 Russian attack on Constantinople, brought Constantine to Kherson, or Korsun, where he learned Hebrew, interestingly enough, and it's said as such in the sources, from local Jews in preparation for his religious debate with Jews at the Khazar court. That they debated in Hebrew is not impossible, but we don't know. We only have this account. The proselytizing efforts were in any event unsuccessful. Although medieval Jewish and Muslim accounts explain the conversion in terms favorable to or within their respective religious traditions, it seems most probable that the Khazar choice of Judaism, as with virtually any conversion of that era, was politically motivated. It gained them entry into the world of the Abrahamic faiths, but did not bring with it entangling political baggage. The Judaized Khazar ruler was independent of both caliph and emperor. He was, in essence, their equal. After the conversion, as before it, Khazaria enjoyed a reputation for religious tolerance. Al-Mas'udi, noting the presence in the Khazar capital of Muslim merchants and artisans who came there because of Khazaria's justice and security. In other words, religion did not discriminate. They did not discriminate in religious terms against other groupings. In the 920s, Muslim legal affairs were handled by a Muslim retainer, a ghulam, as our sources call him. They give him a title, Khaz. We don't know what this title means, what it stood for. But slightly later sources, Muslim accounts again, report that Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities each had 2 judges to handle their legal matters, and the pagans had 1 judge, as the pagan religion, they argued, merited only 1. Muslim constituted very likely the largest community in the Khazar cities, as I've mentioned, playing a dominant role in the urban and commercial life of the state. The chief minister of the ruler was a Muslim. And we again told this in our sources. And the Ors, a special salaried guard corps of the Khazar Cognate, consisted exclusively of Muslims from Khwarezm. Khazaria's economy was quite varied. Al-Istakhari's statement that the Khazars produced only fish glue, isinglass, is contradicted by other authors, including Al-Istakhari himself, who reports that their possession of extensive cultivated lands, implying that there was wheat production, wheat growing, and the archaeological evidence says as much as well. Fishing is attested by fish hooks found in their winter quarters, fish along with bread and rice, and we don't know where they obtained their rice. It's hard to imagine it being cultivated in the lower Volga region, played an important role in their diet. Al-Jahiz, writing around 860, who died in 869, reports that they exported armor and helmets. The Khazar elite seems to have transitioned to a kind of semi-nomadism, wintering in the cities and going out to their pasturages, fields, and vineyards, beginning in the month of Nisan, April and May, perhaps collecting tribute as they progressed on their way through their territories and then back to Atil. Pastoral production remained important. The Hudud al-Alim remarks that they exported, quote, cows, sheep, and innumerable slaves, end of quote. Al-Muqaddasi comments that Khazaria has, quote, numerous livestock, honey, and Jews, indicating that a substantial Jewish population had developed there, both Judaized and Jews that apparently had taken refuge in the country. Scholars are hard put to define the later Khazars as nomads, semi-nomads, or transitioning to settled life. Perhaps they were all 3. They extracted from subject peoples or imported precious hides, honey, wax, musk, etc., and re-exported them to the Islamic world, becoming one of the main channels through which the goods of the Baltic and northern forests entered the caliphate. The slave trade was an important part of the Khazar economy, as it was to so many other economies. Khazaria, part of the Silk Roads that traversed Eurasia, and I use the word Silk Roads cautiously because there are many people who are now arguing that it didn't really exist. And in any event, one should not think of it as a paved highway running from Dunhuan in China to to Regensburg in Germany, but rather it's a series of linking routes from town to town at best. In any event, these goods traversed Khazaria, and the Khazars tithed the goods that crossed their lands, thereby securing a source of revenue that allowed the Khagans of Atil to maintain their hired guard corps. One of the features of Khazar governance, quite relevant to the history of the Hungarians, was the institution of diarchy, in which the Khagan had become a sacralized figure who reigned but did not rule. Actual governance was left to what the Muslim sources refer to as the king, the Malik, who by the early 10th century bore the title of Khagan Bey, along with two additional sub-rulers, a Kundu Khagan, and this is where the Hungarian title Kende came from, and Javshir, as we've seen, mentioned it earlier. We don't know what it stands for, indicating further growth of Khazar executive authority. The Khagan Beg's growing executive authority is attested by the first half of the 9th century. The sacralization of the Khagan may have developed later. The Khagan possessed a golden throne and richly accoutred cart tent, symbols of royalty. His residence in the capital was higher than that of the Khagan Beg. The early Hungarian Union had a political structure mirroring in some respect that of the Khazars, hardly surprising in light of the role that the Khazars played in establishing the Arpad ruling dynasty, and the perhaps, again, our sources, you add a letter and you can change dramatically whether it's 3 years, 30 years, or 300 years that they lived within the Khazar orbit or under Khazar rule. Kundu is reflected in the Hungarian title Kende, who was symbolically the higher or supreme king. Gardazi calls him the Malik Buzurg, the supreme ruler who reigned, and the Dula who carried out the affairs of governance and led the army. This title Kende, Kundu, is cognate with Mongol Kundu, which means respect or honor, but is not attested elsewhere in Old Turkic. May have existed. We don't know. It hasn't surfaced yet in any of the text other than respect to the Khazars. And even in that text where we have the Khazars, it is misspelled as Kundur, where the final R is obviously for the Vav, the U. Jula, we do find elsewhere. It's West Old Turkic Jula, probably the Eastern form of probably the Oguric form rather, of Eastern Old Turkic Yula, which means a torch or lamp, but is noted in some Uyghur Turkic names. Constantine Porphyrogenitus knows of the Hungarian Yula or Dula, together with Karkhas and other titles under the Arpadids, but says nothing of the Kende, interestingly enough. He records Yula, however, as a Pechenek title, which figures in the names of various clans, such as the Khabuksin Yula or Khabukshun Yula. The assignment of the title Kende and Yula to various figures in early Hungarian history remains a topic that is much discussed, but not 100% confirmed. In any event, Ligeti, who was one of the great specialists in Old Hungarian and in the Altaic influences that Hungarian is very important in terms of having borrowed large numbers of Western Old Turkic terms, as we now have Rolnatash's outstanding work on the subject. Ligeti considered these borrowings from Khazar, and we find this name, Geza, as I've mentioned before, developing from Jeucha, Geza, and then we have Yilik, Yelech, and also Ilik, Ulu, Yelu, as well as a clan named Tarkan, coming from Tarkhan, so on. There's a whole long list of Hungarian names and terms that we could note here. The Khazar polity, whose administrative contours are not fully known, may best be described as a quasi-imperial xenocracy, more than an imperial confederacy or super-complex chieftaincy, but not a state in the full traditional sense. It possessed administrative officers such as the Eltibers, the Helitber, as I mentioned, who governed subject peoples like the North Caucasian Huns and Volga Bulgars. There were Tuduns who functioned as fiscal and administrative officers, again, typical of the Turk empires. The Khagan possessed heaven-sent charisma, becoming a venerated talisman for the well-being of the state. He appeared in public only 4 times a year. Officials closest to him entered his presence only after performing purification rites. His investiture ceremony, as we noted, was identical to that of the Ashina Turks, with the inclusion of ritual strangulation and so on. He was enthroned by the Khagan Beg, but the latter's legitimacy was predicated on his closeness to the Khagan, who could depose him. The origins of the Khazar diarchy have led to speculations that the sacralized Khaganate was the result of internal conflicts stemming from the conversion to Judaism, in which a triumphant Judaizing Khagan Beg relegated the Khagan to a position of holy powerlessness. We have no evidence that this was the case. Jewish precedents for such a kingship are absent. The diarchy does not appear to have been the result of a civil war brought about by religion, although we know of at least one civil war in Khazaria, the famous Kabar revolt, in which the losing faction, the Kabars, migrated and joined the Hungarians before the migration to Pannonia in 895. Interestingly enough, Kabar archaeology, where in those sites that we can determine were Kabar, show traces of Judaization, indicating that religion could not have been a factor in their conflict with the central government. Khazar sacral kingship constituted a supranational institution standing above its polyethnic subjects, from whom it took wives, hostages, and maintained the comitatus of foreign origin, the Ors, which we've already mentioned. And indeed, these may point to perhaps Iranian models of a kingship as exerting some kind of influence. Khazaria was, and I'll be concluding with this fairly shortly, I think. Khazaria was Byzantium's first line of defense against the Eurasian nomads. In 840-841, the Byzantines helped the Khazars to build Sarkil or Sharkil, later Bielavieja, which is simply a translation of Sarkil, a brick fort on the Don, aimed at controlling or supporting the Hungarian Union, which was pressed by the Pechenegs and later by the Oghuz, against the Rus. Sarkil appears to have been part of a larger system of fortifications of Khazar inner core lands. The Kabar revolt indicated that the Khazars were no longer able to maintain control over elements within their own union. This was clearly demonstrated circa 895, when the Hungarians, Khazar allies, were pushed out of the Pontic steppe by the Pechenegs. After 900, a shift in trade routes favored Volga Bulgaria, whose increasingly independent ruler invited an Arab delegation to his land in 921-922 in furtherance of his policy of Islamization and drawing closer to his realm's Muslim trading partners in Khwarezm and further to the east, a further sign of diminishing Khazar power. More evidence of decline is seen in the Rus expeditions via the Khazar-controlled Volga to raid the Muslim lands around the Caspian, starting before 884 and continuing into the 10th century. The Rus, by the latter part of the 9th century, were probably contesting Khazar control over some of the Eastern Slavic tribes. By the mid-10th century, Khazaria's ambivalent acquiescence in the Rus raids had changed to enmity. Joseph writes that he warred with the Rus, preventing them from destroying Muslim lands, as he says, up to Baghdad. Constantinople's policy also had changed, perhaps a consequence of the growing Rus-Khazar enmity, which encouraged the Pechenegs and other nomads to war on the Khazars. In 965, the Rus ruler Sviatoslav, who died in 972, attacked Sarkil, and Atil apparently in alliance with the Oghuz, a point that is often omitted. There was a second, perhaps even more devastating attack that followed several years later, around 967 to 969. Some Muslim accounts report that the Khazar ruler appealed to Khwarezm for aid and converted to Islam to gain it. This is according to Ibn Miskawayh, who maintained that all the Khazars except for the Khagan converted. If so, this may account for the difficulties in finding Judaic Khazar traces. There is a report in Rus sources of Vladimir I's victory over the Khazars in 985, pointing to ongoing Rus actions along the Volga. Although the accounts are at times contradictory and several Rus groupings may have been involved, Khazaria after 968-969 ceased to be a major power. Khwarezm, Volga, Bulgaria, Shirvan, the Oghuz, and various Rus groupings all sought pieces of it. Thereafter, infrequent notices about the Khazars are usually associated with the Crimea of Tmutarakan, which were probably continuing pockets of local political importance. Khazaria fell due to a number of factors. Growing internal socioeconomic stratification is often posited, but our sources make no comment about it. Constant warfare with other steppe peoples was costly and took its toll. The extraction of tribute and trade duties was premised on the military might which financed it. Interruptions caused by increasing Rus competition for control over tributary Slavs and the growing prominence of Volga Bulgaria, which supplanted Khazaria as a source for the products of the north to the Islamic world, were the key factors. So this marks the end of the Khazar state by 968, 969. Bits and pieces hung on in Tmutarakan and elsewhere, but they no longer played anything even remotely approaching the role that the Khazar state as a dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Eurasian steppe world had played up to that time. So this, I wouldn't say in brief, but this in greatly encapsulated form is what we can say more or less with some degree of certainty about the Khazars and about their language. As you can see, there are problems at almost every turn. Our most important sources, in addition to the Hebrew documents that Joseph produced, the letter that Joseph produced to Hastai ibn Shaprut, as well as the letter of a anonymous Khazar Jew, and in Hebrew, and one document from the Cairo Geniza, written in Hebrew, but with an inscription in Turkic runic script, which had, but in a not a form of a runic script that is identical in pronunciation to the runic script we know from the Orkhon inscriptions and so on. And there are a number of readings that have been offered, the most well-known being that of Omelyan Pritsak, which give us some idea of the relationship of the Khazar Judaized community, the Jewish communities that were, we believe the letter was written in Kiev, though there's one school of thought that says it was written to the community in Kiev. And the letter is a rather prosaic, standard kind of letter. They're trying to raise money to ransom someone who's been kidnapped. So it's one of those daily live kind of letters rather than an important historical document. What is so important is that one, it's in Hebrew with a number of names that are clearly of non-Hebrew origin and point to perhaps the Slavic language, to the Khazar language, in one case, most likely to Slavic being spoken by elements of this community, as well as the all-important Turkic inscription, open to a variety of interpretations. But this is it. We lack a full text in Khazar, which is basic for our understanding of of any people. And for a very long time, the Khazar archaeology, for a variety of political reasons, was suppressed in the Soviet Union. It was simply a subject that they didn't want to touch. There were two bad stages in the history of medieval Rus. One was the period of Khazar rule. Indeed, they refer to it as the Khazar yoke, and then the period of Mongol rule, in which the Rus fell captive, or the antecedents of what would become the Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarusian states fell captive to the Mongols. So they were put on that level, and for that and a variety of other reasons, this was downplayed. It's only begun to redevelop in modern times, where you get a more objective view of the data coming out of Khazar archaeology. With the DNA tests, it's only very recently that they've said with certainty that these are Khazar finds that are Khazars, whatever that may have meant. But the DNA, as I've mentioned, is uncertain. Yes, it is. There are haplogroups, and I am no expert in DNA, that are associated with Turkic peoples, but there is a considerable complication in ethnic attributions of DNA in a number of areas. I can say, speaking myself as someone who's done a number of DNA tests, I've ended up with results that have placed me all across Eurasia, everywhere from having antecedents small in number in the Northeast Asian world to the Basques, and that is a kind of stretch that is a bit far. So the DNA evidence is important, but I think we have a lot more work to do with it before we can definitely make these kinds of attributions. So with that, I'll end this presentation, which I had said I would keep to about an hour, but I think I've gone over my original time. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, dear Peter Golden Bilgen. You have presented a very dear knowledge about Khazars and their language, and also many important knowledge. Thank you very much again. And you said cold rice, meaning
heating up cold rice
from Chinese language, translated. But we say in Turkish temcit pilavı, but this temcit pilavı is the dearest temcit pilavı. You know. Thank you very much for this presentation, for a magnificent presentation. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Evet, Timur Kocaoğlu Bilgem'in elini görüyorum. Buyurun Timur Kocaoğlu Bilgem.
Recai Bilgen, ilk önce sizi kutlarım. Çok önemli bir oturuma başkanlık yapıyorsunuz. Peter Golden gibi Türk tarihi, kültürü ve onun yanında tabii dilleriyle ilgili büyük bir uzman olan Peter Golden'ı ağırlıyoruz bugün. Peter Golden Bilgen, sizi kutlarım. Dediğiniz gibi elimizde yazılı metinleri olmadığı için Khazar dili konusunda maalesef ayrıntılı bir bilgiye sahip değiliz, ama siz çeşitli kaynaklardan İslami kaynaklara ve başka dillerdeki yararlanarak bize çok güzel bir portre çizdiniz. O elimizdeki sayılı kelimeler, şahıs isimleri, terimler gibi. Bir de tabii hokurum diye bir söz var. Hokurum yani okuyorum anlamında. Onun dışında maalesef bir de paralar var tabii. Ama çok güzel ayrıntılı bilgi verdiniz. Size benim 2 sorum var. Birisi genel, birisi de kişisel olacak. Let me ask you my questions in English. I have 2 questions. One is general, but one is personal. So I will ask the first general question. Is that as you noted that when after the demise of the Khazar Cognate, many Khazars moved outside of Khazaria to Europe, to Caucasia, to Central Asia, many different places. And since their languages also, spoken languages also has dispersed among their various groups. But today we see the Karayim, the Karay Turks, the scholars of the Karay Turks claim that the roots of their Karay language goes to the Khazar Turkic language, but we see more Kuman features in today's Karay language than the Khazarian. But do you see any traces of linguistic features that may survive in the Karay language? What you say? Let me ask the second question, is that you and I both, we had our DNA test, and you shared with me that my biggest portion of my DNA result is from Altai and Siberian region, 29%. But you also said that, for your surprise, a portion of your DNA also came from the Altai and Siberia region. So
Yes.
can you explore a little bit about that? But my first question is about the Karay.
Okay. Two different questions, well, related questions and good questions, very, very good questions. With the Karayim, it has become very complicated because it is heavily politicized. In the course of the 19th century, and I have to go back a little bit, in order to escape the increasing official anti-Semitism of the Russian Tsarist government, a number of Karaite intellectuals began to emphasize the fact that Karaism antedates the crucifixion of Christ, and therefore they are not in any way involved with the usual accusations of being Christ killers that were being thrown by anti-Semites at Jews and resulting in special taxes and other kinds of things such as forced recruitment in large numbers into the military. And in those days, when you recruited into the Russian military, it was initially life service, not for 2 years. Askerlik was for your whole life. And then it was reduced to only 25 years, the so-called Nikolaevsky Soldat. So they wanted to escape this, and they were accepted as such. But there was still no attempt to connect them with the Khazars. Under Firkovich, who was one of the great scholars of the Karaites, this was promulgated and lobbied by him, while at the same time he went abroad to a variety of Jewish communities in the Middle East and elsewhere to gather up Hebrew manuscripts presenting himself as a Jew, which he considered himself, but with a different sect. In all religions, there are these divisions. Karaism as such goes back to about 8th or 9th century in Iraq, but some would argue that it goes back even earlier, and it represents one line of development of Judaism, and I think that is correct. He is responsible, by the way, for the very large collection of Hebrew manuscripts that you find in the library of St. Petersburg, one of the great collections in the world of these manuscripts. In the course of the late 19th and into the early 20th century, to some degree influenced by Polish scholars that had become interested in this issue, the process of what other scholars have referred to as de-Judaization of the Karaim began. At first, only under a group of intellectuals, Shapshal, for example, Surya Shapshal, who studied in Turkey, and so on. And they began to say, well, we're Turkic speakers, therefore we are of Turkic origin. Even though there's no evidence, there are allegedly some poems that make reference to the Khazars, but they may have been more recently created. Let's put it that way. There is no real evidence that the Karaites of Eastern Europe, and the person who's one of the big specialists on this now is Mikhail Kisilov, who is from the Crimea. He himself, he knows all the requisite languages. Despite his name, which might point to Kisilov, though it's Kisilov, written Kisilov, not Kisilov, is actually Russian Orthodox in religion. But he has interest in both the history of the Karaim, and he's written a number of very good books on them, and on the Krimchak, who are rabbinical Jews who are speakers also of Turkic and have been speakers of various Turkic languages, well, at present, Crimean Tatar in its various forms. The Crimean Tatars themselves are composite people, as are most people really, to one degree or another, and are speakers of this, well, speakers of Turkic, but rabbinical rather than Karaite. And there's now, because, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, during the war, the Germans were willing to recognize the Karaites as not being Jews. And that saved them from the Holocaust. And as a consequence, that only strengthened their conviction that they would continue to have this, present themselves as such. And they become very upset when one indicates, well, all the other Karaites in the world, and there were groups in Egypt, there are groups elsewhere, and they're now they're located in Israel. Indeed, that is the center of the Karaite religion. Consider themselves part of the larger grouping of Jews, but that becomes also a very complicated issue. Because there's been a lot of DNA studies done about the Jews, and this gets into one aspect of the second part of your question. The general consensus is among the geneticists is that the Jews of Eastern Europe, the so-called Ashkenazi, in addition, of course, to the Sephardic Jews, are of Middle Eastern origin, and that their close relatives, genetically speaking, bearing the same DNA, are Syrians, Lebanese, which is again what you would expect if they come from that area, and heaven forfend, Palestinians, who in many instances are cousins, distant cousins, but cousins. These were originally Jews who became Christians, who became Muslims, as did many others in that area. So it becomes a complicated issue. But generally, the consensus, with some exceptions, and these again are very political in their orientation, with some exceptions that say that the Jews are descended from the Khazars, that the Ashkenazic Jews are descended from the Khazars, and therefore the claims to the Holy Land, to Palestine, to Israel, are without any genetic foundation. Well, you know, this is politics. It's not scholarship. The scholarship, by and large, points to this Middle Eastern origin. Now, as to this larger question, the attributions, yes, I think in a general way you can make these statements that among people X you'll find certain types of DNA predominating, and among people Y you'll find certain types of DNA predominating. For example, even with, and I've done some reading about this, among Turkic peoples, and there's a great interest in DNA in Central Asia now, among the Kazakhs in particular. I've met with a number of Kazakh scholars who are doing DNA work, genetic work, and so on. There is, not unsurprisingly, they say, where did this American-Indian relationship come from? Some people are finding that they have 3%, 5%, 6% American Indian. They're wondering, where did this come from? Not a surprise, because you're going with this DNA, with ancient DNA, you're going way, way, way back. The American Indian populations came out of Siberia. So it's not surprising that there would be genetic relationships between the two, and they came in several waves. And even the waves are somewhat physically different. Some are more East Asian phenotypes, others less so, and that goes back to, again, various changes that occurred, mutations that occurred among these groups. So with all of us, whatever the claims, unless you've lived on an island in the midst of the Pacific with no one else around for the last 30,000 years, the chances are you're a mix of many things, of a number of groups. And certainly with the Turkic peoples, which is one of the most fascinating aspects of the study of the Turkic world, as I often used to tell my students, is that I can go from Vienna to Manchuria and deal with the Turkic world in one form or another. So it gives me an excuse to read about a great many things and a great many areas. So yes, you have these concentrations, but there are still lots of things that don't fit in 100%. My family, as a few of you will know, comes originally from Belarus. The name obviously was changed, not at Ellis Island, which is an American myth. No names were changed at Ellis Island, but it was changed by the ships when they left Europe. They wrote down whatever they heard or whatever sounded right to them, and that was what was given to the people at Ellis Island and elsewhere when people entered the United States. And my original last name, Golizin, ended up being Golden because that was as close as they would be able to get to that form. But with these tests, I ended up as being Mediterranean without any specific grouping. Mediterranean, Southwest Asian, Northern European, and Northeast Asian, with also connection to the Denisovans, which is a new form, newly discovered hominin group that was in the Altai. So Timur, we're probably distant cousins on that basis. With this from Denisova.
Peter, how much, this percent of Denisovan is in your genetics?
1.4. 1.4%.
I also have 4.7.
All right, well, there you go.
Yeah, we are relatives. Yes.
Yes, we're relatives. So,
and I have 2.7% Neanderthal.
Yes.
Yes.
You have more. I am only 1.1% Neanderthal.
And 2% American Indian.
Yeah. Well, there.
You two also have 2%?
Yeah. No. I have. One of the tests did give me 1%.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. One of the tests did give me. But again, these tests, and the reason I took a number of these tests is because I was coming up with different results all the time.
Oh, I see.
And one had me as 8% Basque. I said, well, that's interesting, but as far as I know, there are no Basques in Belarus or anything near to it. And I discussed this with a Chuvash friend who is an anthropologist in St. Petersburg, and he said, "Oh, you're a product of an empire. That's all." With all these different elements, that's typical of being part of an empire, and that's true for people who've been part of the Ottoman Empire, people who've been part of various empires of Central Asia, and so on. There's a great mix of people and languages also. Again, there is no connection that one can make between DNA and language. Language moves around. And so if I'm speaking in English, that does not make me an Englishman. It's a language that my family acquired. And with my grandparents' generation, they didn't acquire it very well. Their English was limited and with a heavy Russian accent. It's an interesting question. We're learning more and more about it. And I think over time, the DNA question will become more developed, and it will have a more immediate practical use. But right now, it is still useful. It still tells us something about the general complexion. But bear in mind, with the Y DNA, you're going way back. You're going, many thousands of years back to that Y DNA, and so your distant ancestor with that Y DNA could have been at a very different place. I mean, I have a Y DNA marker that puts me in a group that is close to the Pashtuns. And I've not met many Pashtuns in my life. So it's people move around, and the Turks certainly so, and the Turkic languages. So yes.
Çok sağ olun Peter. Sizinle demek biz 40-50 bin yıl önceki akrabalardanız.
Evet.
Çok sağ olun Peter Golden Bilgen ve Timur Kocaoğlu Bilgen. Çok teşekkür ederiz. Evet, Osman Karatay Bilgen'in elini görüyorum. Buyurun değerli Osman Karatay hocam.
Estağfurullah, teşekkür ediyorum. Thanks dear professor for this excellent presentation. I am sick a little bit and I don't have a good appearance at the moment. I don't want to open the camera. I suggest, dear professor, as a theory, as a reconstruction, that then I want to take your idea. The Sabiroi had surely sub-tribes or feodorates, and they had their own tribal names, ethnic names. Perhaps Barsils, Kabars, and Khazars were sub-tribes or feodorates of the Sabir Union coming from the north. This is the theory, as I said. Since we have records of the remnants of the Barsils, in the 10th century in the north, and there is no a clear occurring of the name Sabir in the east of Eurasia. CMP Serbia is a reconstruction, but we are not sure. But we are sure that it doesn't go from the east of the Tobol River. As for our current knowledge, they all came from the same region, and the alternation of the names Khazar and Sabir during the Khazar Empire, as you know well, inspires me to think so. We have this very clear example for that one. Magyar, only one of the 7 tribes of the Hungarian Union, Hungarians, only one of the 7 tribes, but the name extended to the rest of the population later, and they call themselves as Magyars. Here there might be a parallel case. Khazar was a subdivision of the Sabirs, and later their name extended more and more and replaced the name of the Sabirs. Thanks, dear professor.
Well, thank you. Look, that's not beyond the realm of possibility. The Sabir question is one that still requires a great deal of work, but we don't have the sources. The Sabirs appear in Byzantine accounts at a certain period. They're very important people, as I noted. Their support, military support, beyond the realm of possibility. Yeah, their support was sought by Byzantium, by Iran. They had apparently a well-developed military technology and the like. This is one of the theories. As I say, there are a number of theories regarding Khazar origins. I just have, at this point, I have not been able to discover a people that calls itself Khazar until we have the reports in the Muslim accounts, really, of war between Khazars, which sometimes may be really Western Turks, and the Arabs in the North Caucasus, that is all that that I can comfortably say. I'm not saying that your theory is impossible. I'm saying it's quite possible, but so far attempts to put the Khazars as such before, let's say, the 630s, 650s, runs into difficulty. We don't find that name surfacing as such. But yes, that's one of the theories that must be taken into consideration.
Thank you. Well, Recai Bey said that you are my doctoral mentor. It would be great honor for me if I was your doctoral student, but it is not so. I am a graduate of the Gazi University in Ankara, both in master and doctorate. Thanks, dear professor. I wish all the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter Golden Bilgem, and thank you very much, Osman Karatay Bilgem. And I saw Hayrettin İhsan Erkoç's hand and Akartürk Karahan's hand. Firstly, Hayrettin İhsan Erkoç. And I saw Bayram Guliyev's hand. Later I will give the turn to you, Bayram Guliyev Bilgem. Okay, Hayrettin İhsan Erkoç Bilgem, buyurun.
Teşekkür ederim. Sayın Hocam, çok memnun oldum sizi de görmekten. Böyle en azından sesinizi duymak çok güzel. So, I have one question. I actually had many in my mind, but during your conference you have already given answers to most of them, so I'll just skip them and ask my only question. I think you have read my paper on Chinese and Tibetan sources regarding Türk tribes. Those named Tuju in the Chinese sources. And one of them kept my attention when I was writing my paper. I also presented it in a workshop in Ordu University some years ago. So there are 3 Chinese sources that give us a list of Türk tribes, the Tanghuiyao, the Jiu Tangshu, and the Xin Tangshu. And they list some 12 tribes. One of them is called Beishu, and the Chinese also made some protectorates, some prefectures for all these tribes, individual tribes. And then a century later, we have this famous Tibetan document, which you also mentioned in your conference, the Paleo-Tibetan 1283, which is currently kept in Paris. And this document is most probably, at least the original Uyghur one is from the 750s. And it also gives us a list of Turk tribes, albeit a century later. And they mention a tribe called Parsil. And I already have read your opinions about them in your the book Khazars, but I would like to hear your opinions. I hypothesize that these the Beishu of the Chinese sources may correspond to the Parsil of the Tibetan source, which I don't know, may be connected with the Bersils we see in the further west. But I was never entirely sure, so I would like to ask your opinion on this. And thank you very much again.
Well, thank you. It's a very good question, and not easily answered. Yes, I think that the Parsil of the Tibeto-Uyghur source, for want of a better term for it, is most likely the Bersil, and it probably corresponds to the Bersil that we find in the Tes and Terhin or Tariat inscriptions. Though in both those inscriptions, it's not clear whether it's a tribal name or a personal name. If you look at the inscriptions themselves, they're open to 2 interpretations. So, you know, there are issues there. And it is, as I've mentioned, certainly related to Bertsalia, Bars, and so on. These groups moved around, and we find them later much to the south. Though the comment in the Byzantine sources that Barzalia, and why are they written with a Z rather than with a S, is unclear, and does it signify something else? Because the Arabic also, even when they mention among the Volga Bulgars, the Barsula, which seems to be a variant on this name, writes it with a thud, which is very often used in Arabic to indicate a ch sound, not a th sound, and certainly would point to a velar pronunciation, a velar vocalization rather than palatal. So something like Barsul rather than Bersil. Is it the same people? I think so, but we have to explain that. These are all problems that we have with the Khazars. No one has really been able to put all of this. I mean, people have put it together, but we can't be 100% sure. We don't have one thing that links the other. If we had a source that said, okay, these Parsil, Bersil, a group of them migrate south and become part of or live next to the Khazars, become part of the Khazars and so on, that would be fine. But we don't see that. On the other hand, it's entirely possible that groups of them did do just that. As we know, and here it is more, it is better shown. For example, after the Oghuz drive the Pechenegs out, groups of the Pecheneg remain with the Oghuz, and one of the Oghuz tribes becomes the Pecheneg, stemming from this group. So I mean, there it's much clearer. With the Barsil, we can perhaps speculate something like that happens, but I don't know that we can say for 100%. Possible. All of these things are possible. But I had in my time with my professors, Ihor Shevchenko in Byzantine and Slavic, and Tibor Holashikun in Türkoloji, they were sticklers on sources. They say, okay, if you're going to go from A to B, show me how you get there. Show me where you can point out that this took place.
Okay, thank you very much for your detailed answer, and I hope to see you in another occasion in the future.
For sure.
Thank you. Sağlıkla kalın.
Teşekkür ederiz. Çok sağ olun. Thanks a lot. Hem Peter Golden bilgemize hem de Hayrettin İhsan Erkoç bilgemize çok teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi Akartürk Karahan bilgeme, ardından Bayram Guliye bilgeme ve daha sonra da Selim Karagöz beyefendiye söz veriyorum. Buyurun Akartürk Karahan.
Thank you very much, Professor Peter Golden. I'm very honored speaking with you first of all. I have two short questions. One of them, is there a relationship between the Sabirs and the Suvars that mentioned by Mahmud Kashgari in Divan-ı Lügat-ı Türk? First question is that. Second one is, what's your opinion in Khazar language? Ogur group, Turkic or other common Turkic? I know we don't have any Khazar text, but what's your opinion? I wonder this. Thank you.
These are both very good questions. Thank you for the questions. The Suvar are probably Savar, and very possibly Sabir. And we have them again in a great variety of Muslim sources. My colleague Anton Salmin, with whom I'm often in contact, he's the Chuvash anthropologist in St. Petersburg that I mentioned before. He's written several books on and articles on Suvar, Savar, and Chuvash, and he attempts to make the connection with Suvaz, which is a very common error in Arabic language and Arabic script sources. R, Z become confused. He tries to make that connection that Suvaz Suvas is Chuvash. I don't agree with him there. I think there may be other connections, but not there. So yes, I think that Sawar is probably related to this term Sabir, which produces a whole host of interesting possibilities. But again, it's as we all do, we have to do in this field, and indeed so many other fields. You have to look at the scattered references in the sources, and you try and make linguistic connections, and say, all right, maybe A points to B, and we can go from there. As to your second question, the Khazar Turkic, as I mentioned, is a major problem. Marcel Erdal, whose work you're undoubtedly familiar with, a very fine Turkologist from Istanbul originally. He has pointed out that there is nothing that specifically says that Khazar is Oghuric, is Western Old Turkic. In point of fact, we have material that you can interpret either way, like the name Sarkil. We have one form in one of the Hebrew documents that can only be read as Sarkil, which would point to common Turkic. The others written in the Hebrew forms are open to two interpretations: Sharkel, Sarkel, and so on. So that's one issue, one example. The fact is that the Khazar words as they are recorded in our sources are taken from different groups within Khazaria, not necessarily people representing the Khazar core grouping. And so you're getting their pronunciation and their language. And in some instances, this may be an Oghuric language, and therefore we get an Oghuric type of term. In other instances, it may be Common Turkic, and we get Common Turkic form. So at this point, we can't really say. I mean, when I first began to work on the Khazars, that's what I wanted to find out. And I ended up saying that roughly what I'm saying now, that you can argue on the basis of certain words in both directions, but you can't really say absolutely this is the truth. So really, it's more correct to speak of the languages in plural of Khazaria, the Turkic languages of Khazaria, and the Turkic peoples that made up the Khazar Confederation, in addition to all the non-Turkic peoples that were part of it. But someone who finally discovers a full text in Khazar will solve this problem. We'll put up a statue to this person and give him or her a medal. But until then, we can't do otherwise.
İnşallah diyelim.
İnşallah.
İnşallah, hopefully.
İnşallah.
Teşekkürler. Çok teşekkürler.
Çok teşekkür ederiz Akartürk Karahan Bilgem. Peter Golden Bilgem'e de çok teşekkür ederim. Ard arda çok güzel sorular ve yanıtlar geliyor. Şimdi ben Bayram Guliyev Bilgem'imize, daha sonra Selim Karagöz beyefendiye söz vereceğim. Bayram Guliyev Bilgem.
İyi akşamlar tekrar herkese. Çok teşekkür ederim bizi Peter Golden Bilgemizle buluşturduğunuz için. Özellikle Timur Bilgem'e teşekkür ederim. I have to say that I'm Dr. Bayram Guliyev. I'm from Azerbaijan. I'm researching on the Türkology and also Mongol history, because I have 2 questions. And first of all, I'd like to get information about how you are seeing, and your opinion is very interesting for me, that how is closer the Turkic and Mongol tribes? It's the first question. And second question, that how we could find the Turkish elements or Turkish traces in the Caucasia and Anatolia in the period of the pre-Arabic invasion. Many thanks. It's fantastic to spend with you a time, dear Peter Golden. When I've researched my dissertation, I've used your books and papers. Really, you are very dear for us, for Mongolistic sciences. Thanks. If you will answer, I will be very glad.
Thank you very much for your kind words. This whole question of the Turco-Mongolian relationship has again kind of exploded. And there's a lot of discussion going on now about the Altaic theory, and indeed even replacing the name Altaic theory with Trans-Eurasian theory, so-called Trans-Eurasian languages. And there are attempts to show not just lexical cognates, but morphological similarities and so on. This again, it remains a question. As a matter of fact, I've recently been discussing it with a group of scholars. We're doing it via email across the world with my friend Victor Meyer, who's here, a sinologist at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as with Juha Janhunen, a Mongolist in Finland, and a whole group of others. Sasha Vovin, who's now in Paris, but from Russia originally and taught in the US for a while. And there's a great deal of discussion. And I must say there's no common opinion, though increasingly the anti-Altaicists who have always been present are coming more and more to the fore. That is, the connection between Turkic and Mongol is a question of aerial mutual influence, a kind of a Sprachbund, to use the German term, long periods of interaction through borrowing and certain even grammatical types of forms and constructions, but that they are essentially two very distinct languages. And there's the new work by Shimunek on the Serbi-Mongolic languages, which again sort of, I would say, strengthens the separation between Turkic and Mongol. His main interest is in looking at those para-Mongolic languages like Khitan and Tabrach, Toba, and similar languages. He's interested in discovering their connections with Mongol, within the Mongol framework. So the languages have this ongoing millennial interaction. Whether we can say that this is the result of actual genetic relationship, or simply borrowing, is very hard to tell. For example, and I often ask this, I make this point to my Altaicist friends, Mongol Chilagun, stone, is the same word as the Turkic tash, tal, shul in Chuvash and so on. I can see borrowing words like Khan and the like, which itself is not also Turkic originally. We don't know what it is. You can see where political and certain specific social terms are borrowed. But why borrow the word for stone? Surely that's not a term that is more prestigious if you take it from one language into yours. Yet we know philologically, Chulagun is cognate with Turkic, Old Western Turkic, tal, tial, and tial, chal, and so on, shul in Chuvash and Chulagun and Tash. So it's again, these are all very good questions, but I don't know that we can answer them anytime soon. The second question is again, I know there are a number of Azeri scholars who have been working on this issue of pointing to the Caucasus as being one of the ancient homelands of the Turkic peoples. And I don't see the evidence for it yet. My mind is open. On all these issues, I try and keep an open mind. But I'm still more inclined to see them as Altaic in the larger sense, the Sprachbunde sense, and that puts them in the East as an early place of common habitat. Were they even earlier than that in the Caucasus or Transcaucasia or parts even of Anatolia? Open question. Related to Sumerian, which is one of the other old issues. Well, everybody's tried to be related to Sumerian at some point. The Hungarians claimed Sumerian relationships. Everybody has gone that route simply because it's one of the oldest known civilizations that we're aware of. I don't know. I have yet to see evidence that would bring me into thinking of Transcaucasia as an ancient homeland of the Turkic peoples. That they arrived later, yes, for sure, but I don't know that we could consider Atropatakan, to use an old term for Azerbaijan, as a Turkic center in prehistoric times or early historic times. Yes.
Many thanks. Many thanks. Your thoughts were very important for me. It's nice. It's nice to hear you. Many thanks for everything.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Teşekkür ederiz Peter Golden Bilgen ve Bayram Guliyev Bilgen. Evet, önce Selim Karagöz beyefendiye, ardından Ertuğrul Zorlu Bilgem'e söz veriyorum. Buyurun Selim Karagöz beyefendi. Mikrofonunuz kapalı, açın lütfen.
You hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Hi again. Dear Professor, as Guliyev stated, and all he said, the same goes in Turkey too. Among historians, you have a great place, and we have been reading your works for many years, and we would like to thank for your contribution and your help. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. I am a PhD student at Kazan Federal University, but now I'm in Turkey and doing my studies at Ankara University due to the pandemic. My question is related to Khazar-Rus relations, and more specifically the Scandinavian element in the Khazars, actually. Of course, there are these Norman, anti-Norman questions, and we should keep in mind that. And how should we view the Rus-Scandinavian relations or cooperation or or how should we name it? I don't know. Keeping in mind the Arabic sources, which can be very confusing, and Byzantine documents, and of course, and there were archaeological elements and Scandinavian sagas, of course, and especially lately in Russia, especially after the Soviet Union, there are so many new findings in North Caucasus, Middle Volga region, and Gnezdovo, of course. And there are, of course, questions about the origin of the Rus and origin of perhaps the Khazars, as you mentioned as well. How should we systemize or functionize Scandinavian steppe and more specifically Khazar relations? Could there be any study about it? Because there are mostly taken as Rus-Khazar relations, especially Russian historians, but they don't really mention the Scandinavian part of it, probably due to the political reasons. But I'm really curious about the Scandinavian specific elements, because we know that there are even, especially in Arabic sources, that they have cooperated. There are definitely some relations, but I'm not sure. I know about your Rus article, and I'm also wondering if your opinions changed on the Rus, taking into account the latest findings, especially archaeological findings.
Yeah,
I don't know if I'm able to explain myself enough, but
no, I understand.
For me, even hard to functionize the question.
I understand the Rus question is a very old one. The Normanist, anti-Normanist theory that was again heavily politicized and so on. As near as I can tell, and it has been a long time since I have looked at the Slavistic side of things. Rus is a term that for which there seems to be a decent Scandinavian etymologies, and we have no reason to doubt the Prizvanya Variagov, that the invitation to the Varangians and their role in Rus society, a continuing role, because they periodically were even brought in later on. I think Yaroslav Mudry brought in Varangians at one point. He needed some assistance with things. So the Vikings or Varangians played a role all across Eurasia. The sagas are important data, and they have to be looked at very carefully. Most recently, they were done by Omelian Pritsak in what was to be a 5-volume work, but he only finished the first 2 volumes before he was distracted by yet other things and then passed away. And his first volume on the origins of the Rus is devoted virtually entirely to the Scandinavian sources. So he recognized their importance and knew the requisite languages as well. He had studied Old Norse and so on. I can claim no expertise in this area. I don't know the old Scandinavian languages or modern Scandinavian languages, for that matter. So I think that the archaeological data, one has to obviously put it all together into relatively neat packages. But one of the problems with archaeology is that unless there's something written on it, we don't know who it comes from. Even when the archaeology looks very similar. For example, to distinguish between Bulgar in Saltovo Mayaki area, Bulgar and Alan archaeology, archaeological finds is almost impossible. It's the same material culture as one would expect to find with people living side by side. And when you're dealing with things that are more than 1,000 years ago, it becomes even more difficult. So 1,000 years from now, if an archaeologist finds a bottle of Coca-Cola on the island of Fiji, does he conclude that, well, Coca-Cola, this is made in America, therefore they must have been Americans? One has to be very cautious here. And there we do have writing, which makes an even stronger case. But again, it's background. It's the full narrative. How do you put this into a narrative that makes sense? And I don't know. I know years ago I wrote for the Encyclopedia of Islam a long entry on Rus, and I tried to put together there all of the, especially since it's the Encyclopedia of Islam, all of the Islamic material, which is fairly plentiful. And I still remain, I am somewhat, I am a Normanist in that regard. I don't have a problem in seeing, this doesn't mean that the Eastern Slavs were too backward to create their own state. No, they created a state together, working together with the Rus and others, as virtually all people do. I mean, it's very few that do it all on their own. They always borrow from others. The Caliphate became a great state because it incorporated the whole civilization of the late antique Middle East. It inherited from Damascus and Baghdad, an already vibrant and very high culture, and so it creates this great civilization. So I have no problem with Scandinavian roots, but then recognize that they're mixed together with not simply Slavic, important Slavic groups, but also Finnic groups. A number of these early populations that were up in the north were Finnic, and are still to this day, though they're declining in numbers. And they have to be recognized as contributors to the shaping of Rus culture. I don't think I've answered fully your question, but that's about as far as I can go. It's a very good question, and it's one that's been asked for a long time.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Peki. Teşekkür ederiz. Thank you very much. Selim Karagöz beyefendi, and thank you very much Peter Golden Bilgem. First Ertuğrul Zorlu Bilgem, and then later Attila Yorma Bilgem will say something. Okay.
Professor Golden, it's an honor to be here joining that splendid meeting. Thank you very much for your magnificent presentation. Although you say that kültür name is misread and ra in that word is actually wow, but it reminds me gündüz name. And when I read the Journey of the Ibn Fadlan, book of the Journey of Ibn Fadlan, that word, that name got my attention because it is used as a person name in Turkish as well. But I'm very wonder about your thought for my representation.
Yeah, it's we're dealing with titles, so it is obvious to look at titles, and we have another form of that word. We have in the name, kundacık, written in, yeah, kundacık. even though it's with a qaf at the end, it probably is for a kef. So kunde, and then of course we have the Hungarian kende, and so this points to it being a title of some sort. The difficulty with it, as I pointed out, is the fact that we don't have it, we don't find it today in any Turkic language. It's only found in Mongol and in Manchu. In the Manchu, it's borrowed from Mongol. Kundu, where it means honor, respect, and so on, and is the sort of thing that one would expect in a title. But you know, I think that yes, it can look like Gündüz, Kunduz, or Zayemchkovsky saw it as Kündüd, and he and I had a long talk about that in 1968 in his office in Warsaw. I had the chance to meet and spend a whole day with him, which was quite wonderful. But I'm still inclined to see it as not as a personal name, but as a title.
Thank you very much. Actually, is a personal, it isn't a personal name, is a title. Yes, it's obvious that. But you know, this kültür name is look like Ogric type, not a common Turkic, and it get me to that point, actually making a reputation like that. Thank you very much for your answer, dear Professor Golden.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Teşekkür ederiz Ertuğrul Zorlu Bilgen ve Peter Golden Bilgen. Çok sağ olun. Buyurun Atilla Yorma Bilgen. Mikrofonunuz açılmadı. Tamam.
Evet. Evet. Evet. Dear Professor Golden, I would like to ask something that, well, this subject, it looks, it's some kind of main subject here. And today you already have answered to that. But I remember that many years ago, ses gelmiyor mu?
Geliyor.
Sesiyle
Geliyor Atilla Bilgen.
Many years ago, I did read one article of yours, and it was about the language of Khazars, and you said that there were several languages in Khazar Imperia, and well, Finno-Ugric, that means Hungarian here, and Iranian also, and Turkic, both Turkic, Oghur and Oghuz, and Tibi. So that is very understandable, but I think we could think that because there was it was an imperia, and there was an elite, of course, and people, many kind of peoples. So here is important what was the type of language that the elite was spoken. I think that we could suppose that earlier it was this Oghur TV. Later on, after the Turk Imperia, then after it was the Oghuz, type. But also, I would like to think this so that there is, or there was, two types. I don't think that it's very very good word to call this dialects, but they are this dialect and as the dialect, but they were not parallel actually. I think a very long time ago, the old Turkic language was and then after in different places it changed to the language, and then after, but it's very difficult to find a place that where we can see how it went. But there is there is two places. For example, Paskakov speaking. Two places. One is this Volga Bulgarian, and one is Donau Bulgarian, where they were the places, the countries where they spoke Turkic. Then after, both these places changed so that the main language become the Turkic. So, but we can't see clearly how and when exact it happened. In Volga Bulgarian, we know that a very big Kipchak group came, and so after they changed the language. But in Donau Bulgarian, it is quite the same situation. There also happened that first came the several groups of the language. I mean the Pechenegs, Oghuzes, and Kumans, so Kipchak. Quite parallel actually, but there is no place that except we can say that so here and so it happened.
Well,
so,
this is again an old and fundamental question in Turkology itself. When does the split between the and Z languages, or we can call it Oguric and Common Turkic, which is not the best name, but it's become the most common name used for it. I'm inclined to agree with my old friend Andras Ronataj that a split and the Z form is original, and that the break to the Re occurs sometime around the 1st century BC, 1st century AD, and that we can certainly see it by the 4th, 5th century when we have these Oghur tribes that come after 463, after they're noted in the Byzantine sources. But again, I would not want to bet my life on it. These are issues that have long been argued, and every now and again, as I go through this problem again and again and again, I think to myself, well, an is possible. I often think back to Nemet, whom I first read again in the 1960s, in his Honfoglalo, his famous work, where he cites the borrowing from Greek of besos, of this fabric, which becomes buz, but ber, and so that would point to an earlier z, and then a change. The problem is that we have within Oghuric several periods of changes, and it's not just an erze. You had a the sound in Turkic that became a z in some languages, and from a z into a y, and in others it remains s. So you can have azak and ayak, and this sort of issue. There is now a new book on Chuvash phonetics, the history of Chuvash phonology, by Adyagashi, and that I think is probably a book that, if you haven't seen already, that you'll want to take a look at, as well as, of course, the now it's a work that sits on my desk right behind here, so I can have it easily. The West Old Turkic that Ronataj did with the late Arpad Berta, which is one of the best summations of this issue. And of course, Hungarian being one of our great sources for the Oghur Turkic, before we get the material from the Bulgar inscriptions, which are much later. Yeah, so I that's as far as I can go with that particular question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Peter Golden Bilgem, and thank you very much, dear Attila Bilgem. And then now I saw Hikmet Demirci's hand. Dear Hikmet Demirci Bilgem, buyurun. Open your microphone, please.
I'm sorry. We got very important information from your speech. Thank you very much. I have questions. How do you evaluate the religious apologies of the Khazars? Was it effective in their war of the exercise in the region? How do you information?
The information we have, interestingly enough, the Arab sources tell us the most about the religions of Khazaria. The Arabs were deeply interested in the Khazars. They fought with them. They learned enough about them doing that. But they tell us a lot of information, relatively speaking. And then, of course, we have Joseph's letter that he wrote to Hastay ibn Shaprut. Well, we don't know if he wrote it. His scribe wrote it for him in Hebrew. I doubt very much that the Kagan Joseph knew Hebrew, but he knew what he wanted to say, and his scribe put it in a language that would be understandable and suitable to his audience, and make frames of reference, such as referring to himself as the king of Togarma, the Melech Togarmi, the Togarma king of the Turks. I doubt that Joseph knew anything about that, but his scribe was able to get those thoughts across to him. But basically, that's where it comes from. We have just a handful of documents, and we have the Arab sources, which in the course of their giving material about this, mention Khazar religions and something about the Khazar debates. We have a little bit, we have inferences in Rus sources, but not anywhere near enough. And we have an almost complete silence in the Byzantine sources. And that's not accidental. That was because for them, that was a diplomatic failure. They had hoped to bring the Khazars into their camp, and that meant that the Khazars would become Christians and would become subjects, at least nominally, of the Byzantine emperor. And so they would not, they just simply would not get into that. So it's a rather different approach, surprising approach. But it is curious that we have, even in Western sources, even in Western sources, Christian of Stavelo and others, 9th century Christian sources, we have references to Khazar Judaism. But from the Byzantines, zero. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Hikmet Demirci Bilgem, and thank you very much, Peter Golden Bilgem. And I have some words to say, and I have some, not some, two questions to ask to the our dearest Professor Peter Golden. The first one, I have some words I have to say that my reading Khazars adventure started with Arthur Koestler's 13th tribe, and of course it was very popular, not academic or scientific source or a book, but it was very tahrikkar, kışkırtıcı. I mean, it's guided me to the Khazars problem. And then later, I read your books, Peter Golden Bilgem, and Osman Karatay's, Michael Dunlap, and Artamonov's works, and then the historical sources, Ibn Fadlan's travel notes, Masoudi's Miruj al-Zahab. Then I learned many things, but I have to say that your writings, your articles, books are very beneficial, were very beneficial for me. And I have two questions now. What do you think about the Khazars ethnically near to contemporary Turkic peoples or nations? Which one? Which one is the nearest ethnical group, people or nation to the Khazars? The first one is this, and the second one, you know, Sarkil Castle or Sarkil Castle was lost. The the public and people of the world lost the castle of Sarkil or Sharkel. And what do you think about that? You know, Soviet Union built over there a dam, and many archaeologists and historians couldn't rescue the castle. Do you think this was the destruction or destroying of the castle by Soviet Union? Thank you very much.
Okay, that's good questions, very good questions. The people today closest to the Khazars, we can't say. There is no group aside from the Karaim I mentioned who are doing it for political purposes, who have made a kind of an attempt to trace their origins to the Khazars. We don't know. And indeed, one of the great questions we have is what happened to the Khazars? They disappeared. After the breakup of the Khazar state, they seem to have melted away. Well, obviously they were absorbed by other Turkic peoples that came into the region. And so eventually elements of them become part of the Pechenegs. And every now and again, one comes across the name Khazar as a personal name among Pechenegs, apparently, in Hungary. Probably later on by the Kumans. They're by the Kupchak peoples as they come in, they're absorbed. So, you know, we can only go that far. As for, we can't answer who are their present day descendants. Some people have suggested, well, the Kumuks and the Karachay-Balkar of the North Caucasus, since they're nearby, they must be this. Again, we have nothing to basically support that. In addition, as for Sarkil, the destruction by the Soviets of Sarkil, that's a question perhaps best put to our late dear friend Joseph Stalin, rather than to scholars. He was not interested in preserving those kinds of relics. If I may I take a brief break, because I have to use our facilities here for a minute, if I may, but I'll return in 1 minute. Okay?
Okay. Thank you very much. Sanıyorum anlaşıldı. Peter Golden bilgemiz çok kısa bir ara istedi. 1 dakika olacağını söyledi. Tabii biraz daha uzun sürecektir. Sanıyorum artık sorularda katkı verme, yorum yapmalarda bitti. Döndüğünde belki de...
Şeye baktım ben YouTube'a. İyi dilekler var ama soru yoktu.
Evet, ben de görmüştüm öyle.
Evet, soru yoktu.
Timur Bilgem.
Ama oturumda eğer son olarak sormak isteyenler olursa bir iki kısa soru alabiliriz. Yani.
Alabiliriz. Ya da olmazsa artık belki döndüğünde
evet.
Peter Golden bilgemiz kapatırız programı.
Evet. Kapanışta ben gene bir kere denerim. Acaba kapanış jeneriğimiz olur mu? Bakalım bir denerim. Bakalım ne olacak. Bu arada Kıyal Kamçibekova da geldiler. Hoş geldiniz.
Evet, hoş geldiniz Kıyal Bilgem.
Hoş bulduk. Ya ben hatırlayana kadar saat geç olmuş. Hatırlar hatırlamaz girdim. Koşuşturmacalar vardı biraz. Herkese selamlar.
Kolay gelsin. Sağ olun.
Merhaba.
Timur Hocam,
Buyurun.
eğer müsaadeniz olursa ben Akartürk Karahan Hocama bir şey sormak istiyorum.
Evet, sorun şimdi.
Yani konu da aslında Bulgarlarla alakalı. Ben kendisinin de kitabını okudum. Bu Divani Lügat-ı Türk'ün grameri üzerine yazdığı kitap. Hem Divani Lügat-ı Türk'ü de okudum. Orada bir destan var. İtil atılışıvı aha turur şeklinde. Ve Kaşgarlı Mahmud'un Bulgarcayı ortak Türkçe içerisinde değerlendirdiğine dair bir takım veriler var. Kendisinin de zaten bu konuda ne düşündüğü açık. Acaba hocam siz ne düşünüyorsunuz bu konuda? Yani Bulgarcayı Ogur ya da R tipi bir Türk diliyle ele almak doğru mu? Ben de İdil Bulgarcası üzerine çalışıyorum ve bu konuda çok muallak bir durumla karşı karşıya kaldım. Zekiyev'in de kitabını okudum bu konuda. Zekiyev de çok aşırı şeyler söylüyor. Bunun Çuvaşlar tarafından, Ruslar tarafından planlı bir şekilde tasarlandı. Bulgarcanın aslında İdil Bulgarcasının R tipi bir dil olmadı. Sizin de dediğiniz gibi Kaşgarlı Mahmud'un şeylerini de öne sürüyor, bu söylemlerini. Acaba siz ne düşünüyorsunuz bu konuda?
Bana sordunuz değil mi?
Evet, size sordum hocam. Evet.
Ben o çalışmada Bulgarcayı ortak Türkçe dışındaki Türk lehçeleri içerisinde
evet, öyle yapmıştınız.
değerlendirmiştim. Bu değerlendirmemin sebebi de Kaşgarlı Mahmud'un Bulgarca için sonları hep bir türde kırpılmış bir dilleri var demesi. Yani kırpılmış bir dil, Arapçası şu an tam hatırlamıyorum ama kırpılmış bir dil ile Bulgarların diğer Türk dillerinden, Türk lehçelerinden farklılığına Mahmud Kaşgarlı'nın temas ettiğini düşündüm. Bugünkü verileri de düşündüğümüzde Bulgarcanın bir R dili, RL dili Ogur grubu olduğuna temas ettiğini düşünmüştüm. Ve bu şekilde değerlendirmiştim. Kaşgarlı Mahmud sanırım Bulgar topraklarına, ülkesine gitmedi büyük ihtimalle. Çünkü Bulgarlarla ilgili verdiği bilgiler çok sınırlı. 1-2 kaydı geçmiyor. Büyük ihtimalle o bölgeden gelen bir kervan, ticaret kervanı veya bir kişiden duyduğu bir bilgiyi belki nakletti. Ufak bir bilgiyi nakletti. Ama tam olarak bir Bulgar toplumunun içine gidip orada yaşayıp Bulgar diliyle ilgili veriler derlemedi. Eğer bulunmuş olsaydı daha çok bilgi aktarırdı bize. Çünkü çok farklı diğer Türk lehçelerinden mutlaka çok farklılıklara temas ederdi. Yani Kaşgarlı Mahmud'un o bölgeye gitmediğini ama duydukları kadarıyla da diğer Türk lehçelerinden çok farklı olduğunu aktardığını düşünüyorum. RL dili olduğunu tabii ki hepimiz biliyoruz. Başka da diyeceğim bir şey yok bu konuda.
Sağ olun hocam. Aslında burada çarpıcı olan Zekiyev'in de daha önce İdillerden kalan Şan Kızı destanının İdil suya aka durur şeklindeki birebir aynısının Zekiye bunun 18-19. yüzyıldan sonra ortaya çıktığını söylüyor ama Divani Lügat-ı Türk'te de kayıtlı bir şekilde olması benim çok dikkatimi çekti. Çok da şaşırttı beni açıkçası. Bilmiyorum, ben bir soru olarak kafamda kaldı, size sormak istedim. Teşekkür ederim. Sağ olun.
Ben teşekkür ederim.
Evet, teşekkür ederiz Erzurum Zorlu Bilgen ve Akartürk Karahan Bilgen. Peter Golden Bilgen, thank you very much for your answer to my questions. And
let me make one more comment on Sarkil.
Okay.
It was rather interesting. Plitnyova, who was one of Artamonov's proteges, and did a lot of worked on the Sarkil before it was transformed into a reservoir, and other things. She wrote an article in the late 1990s in which she said, in effect, that in 1951, an article appeared in Pravda, written by a certain Ivanov. Now, Ivanov, that can be anybody. It's the most common name in Russia.
Yes.
But everyone suspected that Ivanov actually was someone who spoke Russian with a Georgian accent, namely Joseph Stalin. And he basically put an end to Khazar studies. And Artomonov, who had written his first book on the Khazars in 1937, had been working on this book that eventually became his Historia Khazar, that came out in 1962. That was a book that he was already prepared to go with at that time, and he simply had to put it into the drawer, and it would not be published because such were the situations at that time. By 1962, things had changed very considerably, and that book came out, and it had a great impact on Khazar studies. I think in some ways he was fundamentally wrong, especially in theories that he got from Gumilyov, who was himself a bit of a strange man, but also his theories that basically the Khazars and so many other Turkic peoples were really Turkicized Ugrians and other such theories, which we have really no basis to support. But Artomonov did publish this book. I had the good fortune in the early 1960s as a graduate student, before I went off to Turkey, of working with Dunlop, with Douglas Morton Dunlop. Though I didn't do Khazar history with him, I did medieval Arab history, the history of the Caliphate with him. He was a first-rate specialist in Semitic languages. He knew all of them very well. Arabic, superb; Syriac, superb; Hebrew, superb. He knew them all extremely well. And he had been given, as he told us then, his interest in the Khazars developed. He was of Scottish origin himself. When he was in the 1930s studying in Germany, it was that time that was one of the centers for Semitic studies, oddly enough. And one of his professors, a very great German Semitologist, Paul Kahle, was the one who suggested the Khazar topic to him. And then he began to get interested in it, began to gather information, and he wrote this very fundamental work, came out in 1954. It is still readable today. There is still lots of things to be gotten from that book today. It has not lost its importance. He didn't, now we know many things better, and he was not a Turkologist, so he could not see it from the Turkological side. But as I said, I knew indeed Dunlop sat on my dissertation defense committee. He was one of the people asking me questions, a good person to have on the committee. And he was a very decent, very kind man, and very British. Very, very British. There was no mistaking that in both his accent and his mannerisms. Very much a British gentleman of his age. But yes, that with Sarkil, that of course has been one of the great the great problems that we don't know what was lost. There may have been yet other materials. And Artamonov approached it with, again, coming from Gumilyov, I'm sure to some degree. He decided that anyone with Europoid features must have been Khazar, and that anyone with East Asian features must have been Pechenegs or Oghuls who were serving as soldiers in Sarkil. Well, if you think about it, that's the last place in the world that the Khazars would have put Pechenegs and Oghuls. They were far too dangerous for the Khazars, and Sarkil was an important fortress for them. And indeed, as we're discovering now, the Khazars were indeed more East Asian looking. They were typical of the Turks of Central and Inner Asia, rather than Europoid in appearance. So, I mean, that was some of the faults that were in Artamonov's book. But his general approach in terms of seeing that as a progression of peoples building up to what became the Khazar state, I think that was essentially correct.
Thank you very much for your answer. Dear Peter Golden-Bilgem, thank you very much. And are there any people, any bilgemiz? Atilla Yorma Bilgem yeniden el kaldırdı. Buyurun Atilla Bilgem.
Açıldı mı mikrofon? Sesim geliyor mu?
Geliyor.
Ben burada bir anımı anlatmak isterim. Bu kitap görünüyor mu? Evet. Bu kitap ben 1987'de galiba çıkmış. Ve de o zamana kadar şöyle diyeyim, Gagavuzlar değerli dostum dedikleri zaman pahalı dostum derler. Pahalı yani değerli. Bu hayatımda aldığım en pahalı kitap oldu. Ama değdi. Yani çok değerli bir kitap. Ve yalnız ben değil. Yani arkadaşlarım da bundan çok faydalandılar. Yıllar geçti. Sonra buna kavuştuk. Yani her iki bilgemize, evet her iki bilgemize çok sağ olun, var olun diyeceğim.
Evet. Oldu. Çok teşekkür ederiz. Değerli Atilla Yorma Bilgem. Evet, başka yorumu, katkısı, sorusu olan bilgemiz var mı acaba? Bakıyorum. El göremiyorum. Reactions ya da tepkilerden el kaldırabilirsiniz. Raise hand or parmak kaldır, el kaldır tuşuna basabilirsiniz. Veya mikrofonunuzu açıp öne doğru eğilerek ya da elinizi kaldırarak söz alabilirsiniz. Evet. Gördüğümce herhangi bir bilgemizden artık soru, yorum, katkı yok sanırım. Evet. Timur Kocaoğlu Bilgem elini kaldırdı. Buyurun Timur.
Siz kapanışı yapmadan, sonra ben tekrar bir jenereğimizi deneyeceğim. Peter Golden'a bir son soru, herhalde herkesin merak ettiği bir soruyu soracağım. Onu size Türkçe sorabilirim galiba Peter Golden. Siz çok meşgul, çok çalışkan bir bilim adamısınız. Herkes merak ediyor, acaba şu anda üzerinde nasıl bir proje üzerinde çalışıyorsunuz veya projeler, tabii bir proje değil birçok. Çok kısa olarak bu projelerin konusu hakkında bilgi verir misiniz?
At the moment, I'm working on 2 books, and at my age, that is a leap of faith to do that. One is a second edition of the introduction to the history of the Turkic peoples. There are some things that I would change in it. There are some additions I would make to it, because there's a lot of new work coming out. I'm pleased and amazed in many respects at the amount of work I see, for example, coming out of Turkey. Young Turkish scholars, some of whom I've seen here today, and the very fine work that they're doing, the knowledge of the requisite languages needed for all of this. I'm also in contact with many scholars in Russia and Ukraine, who are also doing interesting work, published very often in somewhat obscure, from an American perspective, universities in Tomsk and other provincial universities, but sometimes very good books. And people writing very interesting things. And so, as I've joked with some friends, at first I thought that this book just, as with age, it needed a facelift. It needed just a little bit of fixing around the edges in the face. But then I realized, well, not just a facelift, but maybe some knee replacement and hip replacement might be necessary as well. So I've gotten involved with that, but at the same time, when you reach a certain age, and some of your friends reach that age, your colleagues reach that age, and everybody has a Festschrift. And so I end up writing lots of Festschrift articles, and they've taken more time than I expected, because they got longer than I expected. I just finished one that has come out. I have yet to receive a copy of the full volume for the 90th birthday of my dear friend Andras Ronatas, who is remarkably still very, very active. And I ended up writing a 50-page article for just the Festschrift. And I thought afterwards, I said, what have I done? I've gone out of my mind. So I get distracted by these things. In addition, I promised some years ago a publisher in England that I would write a book on the history of medieval Eurasia, where I put together, mainly with the Turks as my sort of centerpiece, the Turkic peoples as my centerpiece, but dealing with medieval Slavic peoples, with the medieval Finno-Ugric peoples, with Iranian peoples, with North Caucasian peoples, with all areas that I've been interested in one way or another. And I'm still very far behind in getting that. Those two things, inshallah, I will get done eventually. But in the meantime, it keeps me active. It keeps my brain still working, more or less. Sometimes more, sometimes less.
Çok güzel. Size uzun yıllar dileriz.
Oh.
Çok güzel, çok teşekkür ederiz. Dear Peter Golden Bilgem, you are still energetic, and you are still hardworking academician, and you are the great example for us, for all of us. Thank you very much for your studyings, workings, your books, articles, and activities, scientific activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Evet, bugün gerçekten çok değerli, yeryüzü ölçeğinde çok ünlü, görkemli bir Türk bilimciyi, çok büyük bir tarihçi ve dil bilimciyi ağırladık. Kendisi bize çok güzel, çok değerli, harikulade bir sunum yaptı. Sorulara, çok güzel sorulara çok güzel yanıtlar verdi. Gerçekten çok bilgilendik, feyizlendik, zenginleştik. Zihinsel olarak, mental olarak, bilgi bakımından. Kendisine değerli Profesör Doktor Peter Benjamin Golden bilgemize çok teşekkür ederiz. Ve siz katılımcı bilgelerimize soru soran, katkıda bulunan, yorumlar yapan değerli bilgelerimize, katılımcı bilgelerimize de çok teşekkür ederiz. Doğallıkla bu katılımcılar arasında bizim TÜSATBİTİG Yönetim Kurulu ve Danışma Kurulu üyelerimize, bizim yol başçımız, TÜSATBİTİG Yönetim Kurulu Başkanımız, değerli Profesör Doktor Timur Kocaoğlu bilgemize de ayrıca çok çok teşekkür ederiz. Evet, saygıdeğer, sevgideğer Türk bilimciler, değerli, sevgili Türk bilimi severler, bugün de yine çok güzel bir Türkbilimi Sanaltayı'nı, 97. Türkbilimi Sanaltayı'mızı gerçekleştirdik. Katılanlara, katkıda bulunanlara, herkese çok teşekkür ederiz. Bir sonraki Türkbilimi Sanaltayı'mızda, 98. Türkbilimi Sanaltayı'mızda buluşmak üzere. Hepinize iyi akşamlar, iyi günler, sağlık dolu zamanlar diliyorum. Sağ olun, var olun.
Sağ olun.
Çok sağ olun Recai Ünal Bilgem. Güzel bir oturum yönettiniz. Şimdi ben kapanış jeneriğimizi oynatacağım. Eğer bir aksilik olmazsa bu sefer herhalde başaracağız. Eğer Recai Bilgem siz beni bir şey uyarın. Eğer slaytlarla müzik arasında bir slayt oynamıyorsa bana bildirin. Ondan sonra YouTube kanalımızı kapatacağız. Kapanış jeneriğinden sonra ve Zoom'da vedalaşacağız. Onun için şu anda olanlar ayrılmasın. Şu anda ben hemen paylaşıp kapanış müziğimizi başlatıyorum.
Onu şeyden alınıyor. YouTube'dan alınıyor.
Herhalde müzik olmadı ama herhalde slaytlar gidiyor değil mi?
İkisi de olmuyor Timur Bilgem. Ne ses geliyor ne de görüntü ilerliyor.
O zaman demek sorun bitmedi. Sorun devam ediyor. Onun için durduracağım. Maalesef bu seferki açış ve kapanış yapamadık. Bulmaya çalışırım sorun ne var. O zaman ben hemen YouTube kanalını kapatıyorum. Bizi YouTube'dan izleyen bütün YouTube